Chapter 289. What kind of person was Fan Xizha? In reality, he was just a common youth in the capital with an excellent family background. That was why he was a famous tyrant in the capital. He was the 12-year-old who had stared at Fan Xian when he first entered the capital, his face full of disgust. Of course, he also had some brains and knew how to restrain his heir to the title of count. At the same time, he was also a young boy who often revealed his naivety and competitiveness at the mahjong table. He was also a genius who often flipped through account books, and developed a fanatical interest that even he himself could not imagine. There were many sides to a person, and Fan Xizha was no exception. He was naive, fanatical, arrogant, and ruthless. If you looked at him from any of these sides, you would be biased. His father was a popular figure in the court, the Minister of Revenue, Count Sinan. His grandmother was the emperor's wet nurse. His biological mother was the sister of Yi Guipin, and his sister Fan Ruoruo was the most famous and talented woman in the capital. She was about to marry Crown Prince Jing Li Hongqing. As for his brother, the one who had vaguely been an enemy but had actually gotten along well with him, he was the immortal poet of a generation, the most favored young official of the emperor, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and the idol of all scholars. The one who had married a princess, was about to take over the palace treasury, had a seat in the royal study, and was visited by geniuses. He was so red that it was almost purple, and his name seemed to have been framed in gold that no one dared to look directly at. Yes, his good older brother was Fan Xian Sir Fan Jr. Since the founding of the kingdom of Qing, such a family background had never appeared. What kind of youth would be born into such a hot environment? Before Fan Xian came to the capital, Fan Xizha was already a famous thug in the capital. But at the time he was still young, and had not yet found his own direction in life. So all he did was eat for free, steal things, ride a horse through the streets, and act like a little tyrant. After all, Ruoruo was there to enforce the family rules, so he did not cause any big trouble. But this kind of life had long been planted in his bones, and the seeds of daring had long since been planted in his bones. After Fan Xian entered the capital, his powerful older brother and sister joined forces to make Fan Xizha obedient. On the other hand, Fan Xian, who had always been pressured by his parents to study and become an official, had been weakened by Fan Xian's arrival. Fan Xian seemed to have opened a window for his younger brother that was completely different from that of other nobles. Fan Xizha finally understood what he liked to do, and what he should do in the future. His future was to become the mistress of the Yi family, the kind of wealthy merchant who could rival a nation. He would be able to fully utilize his talent in business and accounting books. As he gradually grew older, his firm goals in life, his genius calculating mind, and the tyrannical aura he had always possessed combined to form the bold and reckless Fan Xizha of today. If he wanted to do business, then what would make him the most money? Of course it was food, drink, and men. Although the Danbo bookstore, under the management of the young man and the seventh shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, was gradually expanding to the whole world, the profits from selling books were not large. Secondly, the bookstore was more or less marked by Fan Xian. Although Fan Xizha did not care about this, he was more concerned about what he could do. At the same time, the third prince in the palace, his cousin, was not satisfied with listening to the Grand Tutor's lectures every day. Using a brain that was far more mature than his peers, he began to discuss with Fan Xizha how to stir up some activity in the capital. One was 14 years old and the other was only 8. This strange combination created the popular Baoyue brothel in the capital. Because the background of these two boys was too special, this seemingly childish combination brought about unexpected results. The resistance of the government naturally became a help. And when Fan Xizha was pleasantly surprised to discover that Crown Prince Li Hongqing had a close relationship with the brothel business on the other side of Lujing River, he unceremoniously borrowed the popular maid Yuan Meng from Li Hongqing. With Fan Xizha's business vision, with Yuan Meng's understanding of the business, with the power of the third prince, and with these two boys who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth, in less than 2 or 3 months, the Baoyue brothel swept through the entire business in the capital. As for how many people died in the process and how many innocent girls were ruined, it was not within the scope of his consideration. His name was Fan Xizha. Although he was young, he was still a nobleman. As a nobleman who cared about the life and death of flesh and blood on the cutting board. Furthermore, as a young man he did things without fear. This was what Fan Xian was most worried about when he spoke with Wan'er that night. But Fan Xizha was still afraid. So the Baoyue brothel truly began to flourish a month after Fan Xian was sent to northern Qi Kingdom. A few months had passed, and the Baoyue brothel had firmly established itself in the capital. Fan Xizha's worry had lessened, and he thought that even if his brother found out he was running a brothel business, what was done could not be undone. But what he did not expect was that in the half a year since his brother had left for northern Qi, the situation in the court had changed so much. In the spring, the Fan family had a close relationship with King Jing's family. In the eyes of the court officials, they were on the second prince's side. So, Fan Xizhi did not think there was anything wrong with him associating with Li Hongqing, his future brother-in-law. He did not think there was anything wrong with him associating with the third prince, who had been raised by the second prince. But after Fan Xian returned to the capital, Fan Xizhi was shocked to learn that his brother seemed to be in conflict with the second prince. As the son of an official, Fan Xizhi didn't think that his evil deeds in the capital would make his elder brother angry, but his political acumen told him that if his elder brother found out that he was too close to the other side, there would certainly be problems. So, in September he began to tell the people working in the Baoyue brothel to keep a low profile. He was anxious to get out of this business and so he had been very busy. But he did not know who had told the third prince to hide in the palace, and he had dragged things out until today. Fan Xizhi looked at Deng Ziyu who was standing in front of him. He had seen this Overwatch Council official in the manor, and he knew that he was the leader of Fan Xian's entourage. But in the blink of an eye he gave up on the idea of killing Deng Ziyu. He knew that he was the owner of the Baoyue brothel, and his brother would one day find out that he was the owner of the Baoyue brothel. You should go back. I will explain this to him myself. Fan Xizhi's chubby cheeks trembled. He must still be afraid. He waved his hand to stop the thugs behind him from rushing into the arena. Now that things had come to a head, the respect they had for their elder brother still prevailed in the end. Deng Ziyu looked at him, bowed deeply and then left the room. The third prince with a childish voice cursed, "You let him go just like that? How am I supposed to walk around the capital? How dare a mere official try to bully me?" Fan Xizhi sighed in his heart. He sat down absent-mindedly, and his hands unconsciously stroked the smooth surface of the Qingzhou stone table. He squinted at the girl named Si Qinger and suddenly asked, "Where is Yenner?" Si Qinger was confused by the scene in front of her, and she wondered why the owner would be afraid of an official from the Overwatch Council. She was not high enough, and she did not understand the complicated background of this matter. She forced a smile and said, "Yenner should be resting in the back of the pavilion. You want to see her now?" The 14-year-old Fan Xizhi's eyes were filled with a ruthlessness that only an adult should have. After a while he made a decision and said, "Don't worry. Everything will be the same as before." In his heart he quickly calculated how he should deal with this mess. If his father knew about this he would beat him to death. Of course his mother loved him and she could even persuade Yi Guipin who was in the palace to speak to his brother. But his brother, alas, did not even give face to the eldest princess. How could he be persuaded by Yi Guipin? Suddenly his heart jumped and his face lit up with joy. It looked like he would have to beg his sister and sister-in-law. If they spoke, his brother would not punish him too harshly. "I have business to attend to, so I will leave now." Fan Xizhi coldly stared at the third prince. He knew that there was something strange going on. Although he was young, he was a strong man who was willing to cut his own wrists. He coldly said, "I will not come to this place in the future, and I do not care about the profits. But I want you to calculate my share in 3 months." The third prince scratched his head and laughed. "You have second brother and your future brother-in-law to support you? What are you afraid of?" Fan Xizhi ignored him and his eyes were filled with hatred. He told Si Qinger, "Send the 10,000 taels of silver to the other party immediately. Who knows, it might even save your life." Si Qinger nodded in agreement. She finally understood that she had offended someone she should not have. In the private room on the 3rd floor of Baoyue brothel that was next to the lake, Fan Xian's eyes were still looking at the boats, birds and people on the lake. His fingers gently tapped on the table. His face was calm as he calculated this matter. Without spending much energy he had already sorted out all the clues. Since the owners of this brothel were Fan Xizhi and the third prince, the capital government would not investigate it. The Overwatch Council, for Fan Xian's sake, would not make things difficult for them. Perhaps the people in the first bureau still suspected that the owner of this brothel was Fan Xian, so they would not dare to tell on him. It was fortunate that Mu Tai was brave enough to bring this up in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian gave a wry smile and drank all the wine in his cup. Fan Xizhi's behavior had been strange lately, and as the older brother, he had not paid enough attention to him. He had scolded Ruoruo and Wanner for no reason. He had not thought that in this world where men were superior to women, if Fan Xizhi wanted to do something bad outside of the manor, how could they, as his sister and sister-in-law, interfere? As for the second prince's plans, Fan Xian was very clear. In the spring, his relationship with the second prince was not bad. Back then, the second prince had used the third prince and Fan Xian to do this shady business. One, he wanted to earn more money, and the other, he did not necessarily want to do anything to the Fan manor. He simply wanted to use this little brothel to make the relationship between the two parties closer. The reason why he hid it from Fan Xian was because the second prince thought he was doing him a favor. In his previous life, there was the true meaning of a prostitute. What kind of relationship was it to open a brothel and greet a customer? If the two parties had such a deep relationship, it would not be easy to separate them. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, there had been a subtle change. It seemed that the second prince was surprised by this too. In the current situation, the Baoyu brothel, which was supposed to be used to deepen the relationship between the two parties, had become a rope that was forcefully twisted. If Fan Xian wanted to continue to touch the second prince, he would have to consider the existence of the Baoyu brothel. After all, Fan Xian had played a very dishonorable role in it. Based on the evidence the Overwatch Council had found, it was enough to close down the brothel and charge Fan Xian with a heavy crime. If this matter was exposed, even if the Fan family could escape the laws of the Qing kingdom, this would become a weakness for their enemies to attack. For Fan Xian and the Fan family, it would be difficult for them to bear the consequences. For Fan Xian, he was able to stand independently in the political arena. He knew that aside from his mysterious past, the reputation he had gained over the past 2 years was also an important factor. The Fan family and the third prince were working together to open a brothel? The other party had unabashedly poured dirty water on each other at the same time. As the saying goes, one prospers, one suffers, one suffers. One is beautiful, one is dirty. Fan Xian, who had always been a free and easy poet, was now worried. He could not care less about his own reputation, but he had to care about Fan Xia's fate and his father's attitude. Chen Pingping had emphasized many times that he owed his father a lot. And from the looks of it, this matter was not difficult to solve. All he had to do was show some kindness, and the Baoyu brothel would be completely covered up in the capital. He would have enough time to deal with Fan Xia's connection to this matter. All he had to do was reach out his hand and shake it. This seemed to be the simplest and most beneficial choice for both parties. But Fan Xian would not choose to shake hands with the second prince's outstretched black hand. Even if this hand represented peace, showed enough sincerity and was careful enough in its posture. It was full of probing and did not carry out any real provocation. This was because he could tolerate someone using his reputation to threaten him, but he could not tolerate someone using his brother to threaten him. No matter how resourceful the second prince was, he still overlooked a very important point. He was always used to judging things from the perspective of profit. He judged Fan Xian from the perspective of a court official. He forgot that there were many things that had long exceeded the scope of profit and loss, and Fan Xian was much more arrogant than a so-called official. Deng Ziyu had already safely boarded the carriage and left the Baoyu brothel. Fan Xian felt a little comforted. His brother was not so bad that he could not be saved. He silently put his hands behind his back and pushed open the door. He walked to the door of the room and gently pushed it open. He looked at the surprised people in the room and looked at the shocked and scared Fan Xian. His face was expressionless and he quietly said, "Come home with me." Chapter 290. The Baoyu brothel guard outside the door had already fainted. Fan Xian stood alone in the doorway, looking emotionlessly at his 14-year-old brother. At this point, the thugs and young men in the room came to their senses. Some of them did not know who Fan Xian was, and their faces showed signs of nervousness. The young man with the injured right hand recognized him as Mr. Chen from last night. He screamed and brought a few men with him, ready to rush forward. Fan Xian did not have time to think. He turned his hand around and smashed the teapot in his hand. There was a loud bang. The first thug to pass by Fan Xian received a heavy blow to the head. He grunted and fell to the ground. His head began to bleed. The teapot in Fan Xia's hand broke, and the steaming hot tea splashed all over his hand. On the floor, the man's body began to emit a white steam. His eyes looked at the doorway in fear. His right hand, which was holding the half-broken teapot, could not help but tremble. Even the tone of his voice changed. "Big brother, why are you here?" Fan Xian did not answer him, but the people in the room were all shocked. How could the big boss knock out his own man? Everyone looked at Fan Xian in shock. Only the young third prince looked at Fan Xian with an innocent look of confusion. Some of the more quick-witted people finally remembered what he had called Fan Xian, and from that they knew who Fan Xian was. The reason the Baoyu brothel dared to be so arrogant was because of the big boss's big brother, Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council. Could it be that the young man in front of the door was Fan Xian's backer, Fan Xian? Fan Xian did not have the self-awareness of being the backer of a brothel. He looked down and asked, "Are we going back?" Fan Xia did not have time to think about what was about to happen to him. He gritted his teeth and the fat on his cheeks trembled. After a while he said, "Yes." He lowered his head and walked over to Fan Xian's side. He looked like a child who had done something wrong. Fan Xian tilted his head and looked at his little brother. He noticed that the little guy had grown quite a bit over the past 2 years. He was almost at the base of his ears. He sighed and coldly said, "First, you did something wrong. Second, you are not a child. So, do not pretend to be pitiful in front of me." "Yes." Fan Xia groaned. Fan Xian ignored him. His cold gaze swept over the dozen or so people in the room. He found that some of them were the nobles who had appeared the night before. They had escaped, so Fan Xian had not broken their bones with his bare hands. He narrowed his eyes and found that there were a few faces that he could still recognize. He had a good memory. Although the other party did not have the ability to recognize him, since they already knew his identity, he could only humbly step forward and bow. "Greetings, big cousin." "Greetings, uncle." "Grandpa Xian." The major and minor shareholders of the Baoyue brothel walked up to Fan Xian in a pitiful manner and greeted him. Hearing these people introduce themselves, Fan Xian's heart was filled with anger and self-mockery. What the F***ck was going on? Investigating a case had led to the discovery of his own face. No wonder Sangwon said that carriages often came from Minister Ali. The people in front of him were all related to him. If they were not from the Fan family, then they were related to the Lu family. Fan Xia and the third prince were the leaders of this brothel. They had opened this brothel, so naturally these people were related. He shook his head and his chest was filled with anger. He wanted to throw these people, who he did not know where they had come from, into the thin lake behind the brothel. After a while he suppressed the anger in his heart. He grabbed Fan Xia by the collar like he was carrying a little chick and walked out of the secret room of the Baoyue brothel. Just as the two brothers were about to walk out of the room with flagging interest, the third prince seemed to have just come back to his senses. Revealing a sweet smile, he said with pleasant surprise, "Sir Fan Jr." "Oh, cousin." Fan Xian turned around and looked at the youngest prince. A gentle smile appeared on his face and he said, "Third prince, don't ever try to act like a little kid in front of me. Also, I have no interest in talking to a little kid like you." Everyone was shocked. To call a prince a little kid in public. Fan Xian was the first person since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Everyone was shocked by Fan Xian's boldness, but they were also confused. No matter how much the emperor loved him, he was still an official. How could he be so disrespectful to a prince? The third prince stared at Fan Xian, and his lips trembled with anger. Fan Xian's smile was even sweeter and he said, "That little mouth of yours is trembling." The third prince almost fainted from anger, but he remembered what his mother had said. When this big cousin smiled gently, it was when he was very unhappy. It was best not to provoke him. He gritted his teeth and did not say anything. It was in the afternoon and there were not many customers in the Baoyu brothel. News of what happened upstairs had already spread, and many people rushed to the first floor. They were fortunate enough to see the eldest brother scold his son. At this time, everyone who knew the inside story knew that Mr. Qin, who had caused such a ruckus in the Baoyu brothel last night, was the famous young master Fan. Naturally, no one dared to step forward and cause trouble. They could only watch. The thugs and girls who did not know what was going on, could not help but whisper to each other. There was a glimmer of excitement in their eyes, and they spread the news they had just received. Could it be that the little fatty who was being held like a chicken, was the most mysterious boss of their brothel? No matter how they looked at him, he did not look like the vicious character that was rumored to be. And who was the beautiful young man holding the boss? Fan Xian walked forward, holding the boss of the Baoyu brothel. His face was expressionless, but he saw the girl named Yen'er in the corner. Her eyes seemed to be worried. He raised his eyebrows and his heart was moved. He knew that this matter had gotten out of hand, and he could not hide it from the people of the capital for long. But he did not intend to hide it. He had other plans. Walking out of the door of the Baoyu brothel, there was a carriage on each side of the quiet street. Fan Xian's carriage was on the west side, and the carriage on the east side had no markings. But the curtain was lifted, and Crown Prince Hong Qing revealed an apologetic face. His face had long since lost its usual brightness, and he greeted Fan Xian. The sun was moving toward the west, and the dusky light made one feel uncomfortable. It shone through the leaves of the autumn trees, and it shone on Fan Xian's face. He seemed to be pierced by the sun, and he squinted his eyes in annoyance. Teng Zijing appeared out of nowhere and he said, "The master knows that the young master has something to discuss, and so he asked me to take the second young master back." Fan Xian did not turn around and he nodded slightly. He then said, "In a moment there will be people from the clan entering the manor. Tell the guards in the house to be on high alert. Do not let a single one of them slip out." He then looked at Fan Xizha, whose face was pale, and said, "If anyone dares to sneak out again, I will break their legs." Although his words were soft, they made those who heard them shudder. Teng Zijing could clearly feel the anger in the young master's heart, and he did not dare to be careless. He respectfully replied, "The master has spoken. You will deal with this matter yourself, young master. The manor will be closed today and we will await your return." Fan Xian nodded and walked toward Crown Prince Hongqing's carriage. Fan Xizha cried out "brother" behind him, but he received no response. He could only obediently get into the carriage. The two parties beside the carriage did not seem to be in the middle of some kind of negotiation or peace negotiation, but more like they were chatting. Fan Xian laughed lightly. "Why are you in such a hurry to take Miss Yuan back to the Jinghe River?" Hongqing laughed bitterly. "I didn't think Yuan Meng's matter could be hidden from you." Fan Xian replied, "You know what I do for a living. It's difficult to hide something like this from me." Li Hongqing moved slightly to the side and invited him into the carriage. Fan Xian shook his head, and then he saw that in the spacious carriage, besides the well-endowed Yuan Meng, there was another person sitting there. That noble person was half squatting on the seat, looking at Fan Xian with a warm and sincere gaze. Fan Xian's pupils shrank, but he immediately returned to normal. He smiled and cupped his hands in salute. "Greetings, Your Highness. Back in the spring we weren't so distant." The second prince's thin lips moved slightly, and there was a look of pity in his clear eyes. He slowly said, "How did you suddenly become like this?" Fan Xian laughed. "Perhaps I don't know how to appreciate favors." The second prince was silent for a moment. After a while he said, "This is not a good place to talk. Master Fan, would it be possible for us to talk in detail?" Fan Xian's smile faded and he shook his head. "I'm in a hurry to go home and deal with that useless child of mine. I don't have time. I'm just passing by." The second prince smiled at Fan Xian and said something that neither of them would believe. Whether or not the Baoyu brothel case was investigated had nothing to do with him. If Fan Xian wanted to investigate it, the Fan family would lose face and profit. If he did not investigate it, then that would be the best outcome. Everyone would be eating from the same bowl, and the Fan family would have to be more tolerant of him in the future when it came to politics. Although the second prince saw that the palace treasury was on the brink of collapse, he cared a great deal about the money that the brothel brought. But compared to whether or not he could win over Fan Xian, money was a small matter. Fan Xian sighed and said, "Investigating a case has led to my own family, and I've let the second prince watch a good show." "What a joke." The second prince shook his head and sighed. "I can't laugh. The Baoyu brothel's business is too complicated. Although I didn't get involved, I know that aside from the third prince, at least 70% of the shares are in the hands of Fan Xizha. You are brothers after all. If you can't, then let it go." The two of them were talking about something else, and they both knew what they were talking about. Where did he get the money to be a big boss? Fan Xian shook his head and smiled wryly. Hong Yigong's two grandsons also paid a lot of money. The second prince seemed to be kind enough to remind Fan Xian. Hong Yigong was in the Lu Manor. Fan Xian pretended to be surprised and then sadly said, "It looks like we will have to stop investigating this case." The second prince knew that not investigating the case meant that Fan Xian was willing to make peace for the time being. He was happy and the smile on his face was very genuine. He said, "Although everyone's status is different, we are all poor people who live in the capital. You are an important person in the manor and you have to make decisions for your children." Fan Xian said, "I won't lie to you, Your Highness. I am not a pure official who is loyal to the law." He looked straight into the second prince's eyes and said, "Besides, Your Highness has calculated all the details. How can I not give in?" The second prince was shocked. He knew that Fan Xian was not a person who would show weakness. As expected, Fan Xian clapped his hands, expressionless. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the Baoyue brothel behind the carriage. There was the sound of people and horses tumbling, tables and chairs falling to the ground, and the terrified screams of the girls in the brothel. Li Hongqing's face changed. He didn't know how many people Fan Xian had arranged for the first bureau of the Overwatch Council to be placed in the Baoyue brothel. His face was full of worry and he said, "NG, to be honest, even if you make this a hard case, you can't hurt us. Why go through all this trouble?" Hongqing was a very direct person, Fan Xian thought, and a self-mocking look flashed in his eyes. Seeing that he was still 1,000 miles away, no matter how much self-control the second prince had, his heart gradually grew cold. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "It is just some children's business. Xia and the third prince had nothing to do, so they set up a brothel to play. Don't take it too seriously." Fan Xian knew that the business of the Baoyu house was far from enough to deal a blow to a prince. Furthermore, the handsome second prince in front of him had nothing to do with this brothel. If he started with Yuan Meng, he would only be able to get Hongqing involved. If he really wanted to investigate further, he would only end up hurting his own hand. "Xia is my little brother. I will think about how to discipline him." He looked back at the second prince. "But you have to discipline your own brother." Hongqing finally couldn't help but shake his head and say, "NG, you must not misunderstand this. The business of the Baoyue brothel was indeed done by those two kids. I know Yuan Meng came to help, but the second prince and I did not interfere." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Sometimes not interfering and just watching is a very clever move." He looked at Hongqing with a not quite there smile and said, "And I do not believe Fan Xia has the ability to investigate the relationship between you and Yuan Meng." The raid continued and the Baoyue brothel was still in a state of chaos. The second prince frowned and thought, is Fan Xian really so cold-hearted? To protect his own reputation and attack him, Fan Xian didn't even care about the life and death of his own brother and his family. Fan Xian guessed what he was thinking and with a self-mocking expression, he looked at the second prince and said, "Your Highness, your calculations are flawless. I do not dare investigate the Baoyue brothel. After all, I cannot personally send Fan Xia to the capital government." As long as the two sides could maintain their current peace, then the Fan and Lu families as well as the people involved in the Baoyue brothel would not have to face the pressure of the capital government. Even Fan Xian himself thought the second prince had played a beautiful hand. The price he asked for was not too high. After a long time, Fan Xian looked at Mu Fenger, who was far away, making a secret gesture. He knew he had not copied out the account books of the Baoyue brothel, but he never expected to do so. Fan Xia, that little rascal, was being blackmailed by the second prince. Fan Xia only knew how to be an unscrupulous businessman, but he did not know that the buttocks of a businessman were always being watched by officials. The second prince finally understood what Fan Xian wanted to do. He smiled and thought, Fan Xia was the owner of the Baoyue brothel, and there is no way Fan Xian can clear his name. The Fan and Lu families are both caught up in this. If you do not want to make a big deal out of this, you will have to make peace with yourself. The Baoyue brothel will continue to operate. Fan Xian continued to speak calmly, "Your Highness, you should understand what I mean." The second prince nodded to show his agreement, but deep in his heart, he felt a strong sense of unease. He knew that Fan Xian was not easy to control, and he would not allow himself to be tied down by a brothel. He did not know what Fan Xian would do next. Fan Xian's tone changed and he said, "Hongqing, this is not right. You were sleeping outside and I did not have the heart to tell Ruoro about it. I hoped that after your marriage you would be more restrained. But how could you know that Xia was doing such a shady business, and yet you did not tell us? Even if I was not in the capital at the time, could you not have told Ruoro? After all, in a few days you will be Xia's brother-in-law." He looked at the prince and said, "Hongqing, you have disappointed me." The second prince was silent. No matter how smart he was, there was no way he could detect the hidden meaning behind Fan Xian's words. Even Li Hongqing felt guilty. He did not know what Fan Xian was planning to do with this incident, or what ulterior motives he had to achieve. The search of the Baoyue brothel continued and the second prince thought, if you have agreed to make peace, why do you still want to search? He was worried that the black dogs of the Overwatch Council would discover the relationship between Hongqing and the brothel, and so he frowned and said, "Mr. Fan, can you tell your men to stop? After all, this is the business of the capital government. The Overwatch Council interfering with government affairs is something that the Emperor has forbidden." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Your Highness, I am only following orders from my family to come to this brothel and take back a few of my useless relatives. Of course, I have used the men of the First Bureau, which is a private use. But the officials of the court often call on their subordinates to help them move houses, and my subordinates only know how to fight. Asking them to help me capture a few of my relatives is not a big deal." The second prince was angry. Fan Xian had used the word relative, and he did not know what to say. In the Baoyu brothel behind the carriages, the noise gradually died down. The disguised officers of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council pulled out 7 or 8 people. These people were all relatives of the Fan and Lu families, and they were deeply involved in the Baoyu brothel. Their faces looked defeated. At the very back of the group, there was a young man with a vicious face. He had been beaten down the stairs and his body was covered in wounds. It was the young man who had wanted to kill Fan Xian the night before. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and gazed at his terrified relatives. Through gritted teeth he said coldly, "Send them back to the manor." He turned to the second prince and softly said, "Do not worry, your highness. What I promised you I will do. But these people are mine. It is not convenient to use the laws of the Qing kingdom to investigate them, so I will have to use the family rules to deal with them." The second prince thought to himself, no matter how you use the family rules, you cannot hide the fact that the Fan family owns the shares of the Baoyu brothel. You will not have a falling out with me, and I will let you vent your anger on your own. The second prince looked at the people of the Fan and Lu families, and his heart trembled. He did not know what kind of family rules Fan Xian was going to use to deal with them. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and suddenly said, "The people who ambushed me last night, I would like to trouble you to pass on a message. From now on the streets of the capital, do not let me see them again. Yes, that is all." Chapter 291. The First Bureau of the Overwatch Council dealt with the looting of the building very appropriately. They only arrested those who were related to the Fan and Lu families. The little bastards from the Duke's manor had been beaten by Fan Xian and had been sent home to recover from their wounds. They also did not have the right to get too involved, so none of them were arrested. After Uncle Mu and Uncle Mu had arrested the people, they did not say anything to Commissioner Fan, who was standing next to the carriage. They took the young men back to Fan Manor. The people of the Overwatch Council saw Fan Xian stand outside the carriage for a long time and did not go in. The people in the carriage did not come out either, and they knew that the person in the carriage was someone more important than Fan Xian. Fan Xian was a member of the royal family, so the person in the carriage must be someone close to the royal family. The looting of the building did not yield any results. Fan Xian wanted to destroy the accounts of Fan Xizha and the Baoyu brothel, but that was an impossible task. Because of this, he was forced to maintain a temporary peace with the second prince. Investigating the Baoyu brothel was a stupid thing to do. The people of the Overwatch Council left, and the people of the capital government came to keep the peace. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. The Fan and Lu families still owned 70% of the shares of the Baoyu brothel, and they continued to be the infamous prostitutes of the capital. Commissioner Fan and the second prince were having a very intimate conversation. It seemed that the capital was about to be at peace. The second prince, who was in the carriage, looked at Fan Xian's calm face, and he could not help but feel a little admiration for him. What happened with the Baoyu brothel was enough to make most people angry, but Fan Xian was calm. He accepted his suggestion of peace without any hesitation. He was a very good judge of the situation, and he was brave enough to make decisions. Every time he saw that familiar smile on Fan Xian's face, he felt a sense of unease and familiarity in the depths of his heart. He always felt that Fan Xian was someone very similar to himself. Although Fan Xian was an official, he still had a strong urge to have a deep conversation with him. "Hongqing, you go first. I have some private things to discuss with Mr. Fan," the second prince said coldly. He paid no attention to the eyes of the people on the street, and slowly walked down from the carriage. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. He was surprised by the other party's action. Just now, he had clearly said that he was going back to the manor and did not want to have a deep conversation. However, the other party was a prince and had personally come out of the carriage to invite him. Even if he was not giving him face, he still wanted to hear what he wanted to say. So he gently nodded. Li Hongqing looked at him apologetically. He and the carriage left the Baoyue brothel, a place of trouble. The second prince's embroidered shoes stepped onto the street. He couldn't resist stretching. Amidst the whispers of the crowd in the distance, he led Fan Xian into a tea shop. A servant had already cleared the tea shop. Only he and Fan Xian sat facing each other. Fan Xian picked up the bowl and took a sip. He raised his eyebrows in surprise and glanced at the second prince. The second prince smiled and said, "I know you like this. Every time you go to Hongqing Manor, you ask for some sour berries to drink." He then warmly said, "Brother Fan must hate me for what happened at the Baoyue brothel." Fan Xian slightly raised his lips and said, "I am not a saint. Naturally, I have emotions." The second prince shook his head and said, "In the beginning, when your second brother and my third brother discussed doing business, I already knew about it. I even secretly helped. He looked at Fan Xian's face and said, but do not misunderstand. At that time, the court and the capital all thought the Fan family was on good terms with me. I did not have the intention to threaten you. I only wanted to find a place of mutual benefit for both sides and make our relationship closer. Who would have thought that it would become a dirty trick? It was not what I wanted. Fan Xian had already guessed the second prince's thoughts when he built the Baoyue brothel in the spring, so he was not surprised. But hearing him admit to using dirty tricks, he did not know how to respond. He smiled and said, Your Highness, you really do have a lot of respect for me. The second prince was not afraid to continue this topic. He lightly said, I have always valued you. You should know that. So, I do not understand why, after you returned to the capital, you would target me. Fan Xian smiled and said, Your Highness's words are a bit muddled. I'm only an official. What good would it do me to target Your Highness? The second prince stared into his eyes and slowly said, I need you to tell me. I know you would not be willing to be a pawn of the crown prince, so I really do not understand. He had not thought that this prince would be so open and honest. Fan Xian felt a bit surprised. Shortly after, a clear smile rose to his face. He quietly said, Your Highness, you really do not understand? The second prince looked into his eyes and gently shook his head. Fan Xian slightly tilted his head and used his knuckles to knock on the surface of the wooden table. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, Nyolan Street. The second prince was silent. A moment later he said, This is my fault. Having said this, he stood up and bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. As the emperor's own son, he bowed and apologized to an official. Fan Xian did not show the expression that the second prince had hoped to see. He sat on the chair like a piece of ice, squinting at him. Your Highness is Your Highness, he said quietly. An official is an official. This is a matter of life and death. Perhaps Your Highness thinks that by personally apologizing, you have already given me enough of an explanation, and that I, as an official, should be moved to tears and feel a sense of belonging to the nation? The second prince took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger that had not appeared in his heart for many years. He coldly said, Then Master Fan, how can you repair the relationship between us? Fan Xian suddenly laughed and said, Actually, in the last round of investigation, you know why. Who told my mother-in-law to always dislike me as a son-in-law? One moment he was an assassin, the next he was from the imperial censorate? And next year I will be taking over the palace treasury. I cannot avoid conflict with Xinyang. If Your Highness is willing to promise me one thing, I cannot guarantee that I will be biased, but at least in the capital, I will have the Overwatch Council maintain a relatively fair attitude. The second prince's heart trembled slightly. The sliver of negative emotion that had been lingering in his chest earlier had long disappeared. During these few months, his people and officials in court had been closely watched by the Overwatch Council, including the Imperial Astronomer and the others. They had all met with great misfortune, giving the entire second prince's faction a headache. Now that he heard Fan Xian say that he could change the Overwatch Council's attitude, how could he not be tempted? After a moment of silence, he stretched out his right hand and very gently said, Please speak, Commissioner. This sentence used an official title. Fan Xian looked at him and smiled. Your Highness, if you can keep your distance from the eldest princess, I promise you a lifetime of peace. The second prince was startled. He had never thought that Fan Xian would make such an absurd suggestion. Promise him a lifetime of peace? How arrogant and daring. He finally couldn't hold back his depression. In a cold voice he said, Commissioner Fan, are you playing with me? The two young nobles, who did not actually look alike, but their temperaments and auras were very similar, sat across from each other at a table and did not see eye to eye. Fan Xian looked at him and said, Your Highness has many questions and I also have many questions. Is this dragon chair really so easy to sit on? Is peace not a rare blessing? Your Highness has always liked literature, and Lady Shu is also a clear-minded person like Snow. How can you not see through the crux of this? Even though there was no one in the tea shop at this moment, and there was no need to worry that this conversation would be overheard by others, suddenly hearing Fan Xian speak his mind so plainly, the second prince's heart still trembled uncontrollably. There were many things in this world that could only be done and not said. For example, no matter how much he wanted to take the throne, he was still incomparably respectful to the crown prince. Who would have thought that this person in front of him would say it so lightly? It was not until today that the second prince truly understood the extent of Fan Xian's courage. He also became more and more unclear as to what Fan Xian was relying on. A dim light flashed through the second prince's eyes. This dim light was touched by Fan Xian's words. Years of pain finally began to burn. Staring at Fan Xian's face, he lowered his voice and said coldly, "Everyone knows that the dragon chair is not easy to sit on. But I am in the Emperor's home and I have no choice. If I want to take this chair, I can take it. If I don't want it, I still have to take it. If I have the freedom to choose, I would rather go to the Imperial College and study every day than get mixed up in this matter." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly. "Is someone forcing you?" Perhaps Fan Xian's boldness had aroused a trace of bloodlust, and the second prince laughed coldly. "Of course someone is forcing me. From the time I was 12, they said that I was virtuous and that it would be a waste to be a prince. When I was 13 they made me a king. When I was 14 they built a manor outside the palace. On the surface, it seemed like they were chasing me out of the palace, but in reality they gave me the opportunity to freely submit to the officials. When I was 15 they let me enter the royal study to listen to state affairs. Did you know? Before me, only the crown prince had such an opportunity." The second prince's handsome face gradually twisted. "I don't want to fight. But these things are coming out one by one. What can I do? Does the Eastern Palace think that I don't want to fight for the throne?" The crown prince was young at the time, but he looked at me with such hatred in his eyes. "We are brothers. When he was only 13 he already wanted to kill me. Even if I can convince the crown prince, what about the empress? Will she let me go?" Fan Xian was silent, listening to the second prince's madness. It was he who pushed me into this position. The second prince's eyes were like a cold fire sealed in ice, making people shiver. "I want to protect my mother. I want to protect my life. What should I do? Since he wants me to fight, then I'll fight for him." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. He knew that the only one who had the power to force a prince onto the road of fighting for the throne was the emperor himself. He smiled slightly and said, "But have you ever thought that maybe he is just using you as a stone, a whetstone to force the crown prince to mature?" "I knew that a long time ago." The second prince coldly waved his sleeve. "We are both favored by the heavens. Who would be willing to be a whetstone that will break in the future? So I have to keep fighting. If I really do win, I will be happier to see him regret than sitting on that chair." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Why vent your resentment on such a matter? The great prince has already been made a prince, but he seems to know a lot more than the second prince. If someone wants to push you into the river to compete in swimming, your best resistance is to fight to the death and not enter the river. At most, you can turn around and fight with the person behind you. It's not to go into the river and strangle your opponent to death." The second prince finally calmed down. He looked at Fan Xian with shock. "Your words sound like rebellion." Fan Xian shook his head indifferently. "The treasonous things your highness said today are no less than mine." The second prince's eyebrows suddenly jumped. He looked at Fan Xian. A moment later he suddenly said, "Help me, Fan Xian." Fan Xian shook his head calmly, even coldly. "What?" The second prince quietly said, "In the future, you will have to choose someone." Fan Xian did not answer him. He only thought, based on blood relations, this person in front of him should be his brother. He was different from other officials. He did not want to make a choice. He was just a little shocked by the Qin kingdom's ruthless way of teaching, and he gradually grew afraid. Seeing the second prince's sincere gaze, Fan Xian finally opened his mouth and said, "Do not get too close to Xinyan. That woman is a very talented madwoman. I don't know what she is thinking." The second prince calmed down. He smiled and sat down. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that although the second prince was tempted by his power, he still trusted the eldest princess's power more. But this was good. At least in the future, when he was dealing with the second prince in front of him, his heart would be a little harder. "I still don't want to be your enemy," the second prince said seriously. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He suddenly raised his head and said, "Even if the Baoyue brothel incident did not happen, I would still beat you down to the ground." A mocking look flashed through the second prince's eyes. It seemed that he thought Fan Xian's arrogance had gone too far. Fan Xian ignored his look and coldly said, "Perhaps this is the only way for you and Hongqing to survive." The second prince heard the pity and disdain in Fan Xian's voice, and he was furious. He suddenly stood up and stared coldly into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian mockingly said, "Your Highness, do not ever think that you can control everything. That includes the Baoyue brothel." The atmosphere in the tea shop suddenly became cold. 8 people slowly walked in from outside the shop. They were all wearing the same clothes, but it was impossible to tell how old they were. Every single one of them had a murderous aura hidden deep within their bodies. Some were like a knife, some were like a sword, and some were like a giant axe that could split open a mountain. Fan Xian knew that the second prince would not choose to kill him in the busy market. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the 8 people who had walked into the tea shop from who knew where. In a quiet voice he said, "The 4 generals Gan, Lu, Xie and Fan, the 4 gentlemen He, Zhang, Su and Chao, the legendary 8 generals under the second prince's command. So this is what they look like." The second prince looked at him and said, "Fan Xian, I value you, but that does not mean I must need you. So do not be too arrogant." Fan Xian stood up and smiled as he waved his hand. He said, "The Qinian unit under my command cannot beat the 8 people under your command, so I will not make a fool of myself. But there is something that I must say. Your Highness, no matter how many people you have, it is useless for the bigger picture. Otherwise Qin Pingping would have become emperor a long time ago." Amidst his laughter, he threw down his last rebellious sentence and left the tea house in a carefree manner. When he walked out of the shop, he seemed to casually pass through the 8 most capable family warriors of the second prince. He only slightly shrugged his shoulders in front of the Gan and Xie generals and waved his hand in front of the Su and Chao princes. A faint breath of air came into contact with the murderous aura of the 8 people that had yet to be released. In an instant, it spread along the wooden pillars of the tea shop and mixed with the autumn afternoon sunlight outside the tea shop. There was no trace of it anymore. A moment after Fan Xian left, the second prince rested his chin on the table and furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't know why he had suddenly lost his composure in front of Fan Xian and said many things that had been hidden in the depths of his heart. He took a deep breath, and a glimmer of seriousness flashed across his handsome face. In a cold voice he said, "If there is a day in the future when you need to kill him, how many people do you need?" Xie Bai, and slowly put the sheathed sword back into his white sleeve and said woodenly, "I alone will be enough." Fan Wujia's face was dark and he shook his head slightly. He said, "Even if the 8 generals were to come together, they might not be able to keep Sir Fan Jr." The second prince was a little lost in thought. He thought that even the 8 generals did not care about Fan Xian's words. This Fan Xian was a character that he could not see through. But then he remembered that after the Baoyue brothel incident, Fan Xian would not make a move against him for a while. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian carefully used water to wash away the faint fragrance that remained on his fingers. He was a little disappointed with the conversation. Although he had taken a great risk to draw out some of the second prince's thoughts, there was no useful information. He still did not understand the arrangements between him and the eldest princess. It looked like the second prince was a person with a calm mind and a scholarly spirit. But he was not a caring sister, so there was no point in knowing these things. The carriage arrived at Fan Manor. He jumped down from the carriage and calmly walked through the corner door. He quickly walked to the back garden, ignoring the confused faces of the Fan and Lu family members. He went straight to the study room, pushed open the door with his steady hands and then kicked it open. Inside the study room there was a scream. Under the horrified gazes of the entire family, Fan Xizha, who had no idea what had happened, was kicked into a ball and smashed into the armchair, breaking it into several pieces. Chapter 292. Fan Manor was now divided into 2 residences, one front and one back. The courtyard was luxurious and the house was spacious. There were 3 study rooms and the one where the scream had come from was on the west side, next to the garden. It was the least guarded of the 3, and it was also the one the servants were closest to. The sudden scream, like that of a pig being slaughtered, shocked everyone in the garden. After Fan Xizha's scream, 2 women's screams immediately rang out in the study room. Fan Ruoruo and Lin Wanner's faces lost all color. They stepped forward and grabbed Fan Xian's arm, afraid that their husband or brother would get angry and kick Fan Xizha to death. In the eyes of these 2 women, Fan Xian had always been a gentle, refined, mature, and steady young man. Even though there were times when he was unhappy, he had never shown such a violent side. Seeing the frost on Fan Xian's face, the 2 women couldn't help but shiver. They didn't know what Fan Xizha had done to make him so angry, but they still held on to Fan Xian's arm, not letting him step forward. After Fan Xizha had been dragged back to Fan Manor by Teng Zijing, he was as anxious as a cat on a hot tin roof. With great difficulty he finally found an empty spot. He begged Cece, who was passing by the study room, to secretly send a message to his sister-in-law and sister, asking them to come quickly. Fan Ruoruo and Lin Wan'er didn't know what had happened. After entering the study room, they heard Fan Xizha's cries for help, and even joked with him a little. Now, seeing Fan Xian's vicious kick to the heart, they knew that things had gotten out of hand. Their faces paled, and they looked at Fan Xian's angry face with a hint of fear. "Let go," The words that came out of Fan Xian's mouth seemed to have been soaked in ice for an entire night. They were cold and carried with them a cold wind. Father already knows of this matter. No one can stop me. I won't beat him to death. Fan Xia lay on the ground pretending to be dead. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that his brother's expression was calm, and that he wouldn't kill him. He let out a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian continued coldly, "I'm going to cripple him." As he spoke, he easily extricated himself from the two girls' tight grip. In his anger, he didn't have time to find the family rules. He directly grabbed the teacup on the desk and threw it at Fan Xia's face. With a loud crash, the teacup smashed right next to Fan Xia's head. Hot tea and broken porcelain splattered everywhere. Fan Xia cried out in pain as his face was scratched with blood. He no longer dared to lie on the ground and pretend to be dead. He jumped up and hid behind Wanner, crying and howling, "Sister-in-law? Brother wants to kill me. Help." Lin Wanner looked at the blood on her brother-in-law's face and jumped in fright. She quickly shielded him behind her and blocked the angry Fan Xian in front of her. She hurriedly said, "What happened? What was going on? Can't we talk things out?" Fan Xian looked at Fan Xia's sorry state, hiding behind Wanner, but he didn't soften at all. Thinking of all the dirty things Fan Xia had done, he became even angrier. He pointed at him and scolded, "Ask him what he did." Fan Xia was about to open his mouth to explain, but he felt a sweetness in his chest. He almost spat out blood. He knew how hard his brother's kick had been, and for a moment he was scared half to death. He didn't know if he was going to die like that. In his terror, he gathered his courage and jumped up. He screamed, "I just opened a brothel. Is there a need to be so desperate? Sister-in-law, I can't live." After letting out a blood-curdling scream, Fan Xia fell to the ground. Wanner and Ruorwo were shocked. They quickly squatted down, rubbed their chests and pinched their nostrils. By this time, Fan Xian had already vented some of his anger. Seeing that the kid was pretending to be dead, he was so angry that he laughed. He then looked at the open door of the study. There were servants in the garden watching from afar. He closed the door behind him and said expressionlessly, "That kick didn't kill you. Get up." Fan Xia saw that he was going to be ruthless, so he didn't dare to get up. He could only hide behind his sister-in-law and sister, hoping to stall until his mother arrived. Fan Xian had already sat behind the desk. His face was expressionless, but no one knew what he was thinking. Ruorwo carefully handed him a cup of tea. She asked quietly, "What brothel?" Fan Xian slowly sipped the tea in his cup. He closed his eyes and coldly said, "A brothel." Wanner and Ruorwo were shocked again. The two girls had been scared a lot today. But compared to Fan Xian's kick to the heart, Fan Xia's brothel was a bit absurd, but it didn't bother them too much. In the capital, most of the children of the rich and powerful had some secret business dealings. Although it wasn't very glamorous and Fan Xia, he was young, but did he really have to be this angry? Fan Xian coldly laughed. He pulled out the Overwatch Council's investigation of the Baoyu brothel. He threw it to his sister. Fan Ruoro's face was full of confusion. She took it and looked at it. The file was not very long, but it clearly stated the history of the Baoyu brothel. The evidence was clear and there was no way to explain it. It took her a while to finish reading it. Her hair was a mess and a few strands of hair fell across her forehead. It covered her face and eyes, and it was impossible to see her reaction or expression. But gradually Ruoro's breathing became heavy. It was clear that she was angry and sad. Her lower lip sank into her mouth, and it looked like she was gritting her teeth. Lin Wanner watched this scene with curiosity. She wanted to know what was written on the file, and she wanted to go next to her sister-in-law to look at it. But she was afraid that Fan Xian would take advantage of her absence and beat Fan Xia to death. So she didn't dare move. Fan Ruorwo slowly raised her head. Her face was calm, but the coldness between her eyebrows was very heavy. Her calm eyes were now filled with anger. She looked at Fan Xia, who was hiding behind her sister-in-law and pretending to be dead. She gritted her teeth and asked, "Did you do all of this?" The tone of her question was calm, but underneath the calm surface, there was an undercurrent that made everyone in the room feel uneasy. Fan Xia had been raised by his sister since he was a child. Compared to her, he was more afraid of this seemingly weak sister. He was also closer to Ruorwo. Subconsciously, he slowly sat up and explained in a trembling voice, "Sister, what is it?" Fan Ruorwo's face was full of sadness and disappointment. She wondered how her brother had become like this. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She gritted her teeth and threw the file at Fan Xia. It landed right on Fan Xijia's face and said, "Look at it yourself." Fan Xijia looked at his brother, who was sitting calmly, and then looked at his sister-in-law. He picked up the file and continued to read. The more he read, the worse his face became. Brother knew what the Baoyu brothel had done. At this time, Fan Xian squinted his eyes and slowly stood up from his chair. Fan Xijia screamed and jumped up. He waved his hands and was scared to death. He tried to explain, "Brother, I didn't do this. Don't hit me anymore." Fan Xian squinted his eyes and looked at his brother. He coldly said, "Murder, arson, and forcing a girl to be a prostitute. If you were the one who did this, I would have kicked you to death. But who are you? You are the owner of the Baoyu brothel. Without your approval, would those bastards dare to do these things?" Fan Xijia's voice was trembling and he said, "Some of these things were done by my brother. It had nothing to do with me." Fan Xijia, Fan Xijia. Fan Xian coldly laughed and said, "Ruoruo said you were like a pig and she was right. Do you think you can wash yourself clean like this? I've really underestimated you. You've actually become the leader of the small tyrants in the capital. You're really capable. You're so capable." Fan Xijia's heart grew colder and colder. Although he was young, his mind was sharp and ruthless. He knew that his brother wouldn't listen to his explanation, so he felt more and more wronged. With a long face he howled, "It really has nothing to do with me." Right at this moment he saw another scene that made his soul jump out of his body. Ruoruo's face was calm. She pulled out a stick that was no longer than an arm and handed it to Fan Xian. The first time Fan Xian came to the capital, Ruoruo used a ruler to strike Fan Xijia's palm. The ruler was the Fan family's small family rule. What was the big family rule? It was a stick. It was a stick with thick thorns wrapped around it. It was a terrifying rod that could split open the flesh of the person being tortured with a single strike. In the entire Fan manor, there was only one person who was lucky enough to experience the big family rule. That person was once Count Sinan's most favored follower. He used the power of the Fan manor and Fan Jian's favor to cause trouble in the Ministry of Revenue. In the end he was beaten down by Fan Jian with a stick. Now he was living in a manor outside the city. His leg was broken and he was miserable. When Fan Xijia was educated as a child, he had seen the man's miserable state. Now seeing Fan Xian weighing the big family rule in his hand, he was scared silly. His mouth was wide open but he couldn't say anything. Fan Xian walked out and coldly said to his wife and Ruoruo, "I am responsible for this. You two cannot escape responsibility." Silently retreated to the side and stood next to Ruoruo. Fan Xijia saw the stick coming closer and closer to him. In his terror, he stirred up the fierceness in his bones. He jumped up and pointed at Fan Xian's face. "Sister-in-law, sister, don't listen to him. Brother, no. Fan Xian, don't act like a saint. What's wrong with me running a brothel? What's wrong with me being a tyrant? Who in the capital doesn't do the same? Why do you have to hit me? You think I don't know what you're thinking? It's just that you and the second prince don't get along and I've dragged you in. You've lost face. So what? You want to take it out on me? You want to beat me to death?" Fan Xijia cried loudly. "Beat me to death if you have the guts. What kind of brother are you? When I was doing business, how could I have known that you would fall out with the second prince? What does that have to do with me? You never told me. If you have the guts, then go beat up the third prince. You only know how to bully someone like me who doesn't have a mother or father to care for him. What kind of guts are you? Aren't you the commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Go catch the capital's magistrate and beat up the third prince in the palace. Go, go." There was a light slap. Fan Xijia's face had been slapped, which wasn't very loud. He woke up and looked at Fan Xian, who was getting closer and closer. After Fan Xian heard this nonsense, he was angry. Although he didn't show it on his face, the veins on his forehead were starting to show. In the 20 years since he was reborn, this was the first time he had been so angry. Most importantly, he had truly thought of Fan Xijia as a brother. Who knew that he would do something like this and speak so eloquently? "You shut up." He finally couldn't help but curse. "If you want to do business, I'll let you do it. If you don't do evil, why would others dare to threaten me? Even if they did, am I the kind of person who would be threatened? I want to punish you today not for anything else but because you deserve it. This has nothing to do with the second prince in the palace, and it has nothing to do with the third prince. Fan Xijia, you need to understand that this is your business." Fan Xian was both sad and angry. "You are so young yet you act so ruthlessly. If I don't punish you, who knows what kind of trouble you will bring to father. I have expectations for you, so I won't allow you to continue down this path. Who cares about the second prince and the third prince? I am angry at you and I hate you. They are not my brothers, you are my brother. He stared into his brother's eyes and said coldly, I have investigated clearly. Fortunately, you were not personally involved in those matters, so you can still be saved. Since you have gone down the wrong path, I will use my stick to help you correct it. As soon as he finished speaking, the stick came down. Under the great discipline, Fan Xija's trousers were torn, and blood flowed everywhere. Finally, he let out a heart-wrenching howl. The sound quickly spread throughout the Fan manor, startling the servants and maids in the garden, as well as Ting Zijing and Deng Ziyu's subordinates. It also frightened the children of the Fan and Lu families who were waiting in the garden. Naturally, it also made some people feel incomparably distressed. The screams of the second young master of the Fan family reverberated throughout the garden. The sound was so shrill that no one could bear to hear it. Earlier, it had been accompanied by Fan Xija's fierce resistance. Later it became a cry for mercy. Then it became a pitiful cry for help. Finally, the voice gradually became softer. Amidst the weak cries, one could hear the 14-year-old calling for his mother. Master, Xija's really going to be beaten to death. Lu Shi knelt in front of Minister Fan, her face streaked with tears, and hugged his legs. Go and talk to Fan Xian and make him stop. This is enough of a lesson. What if he really dies? Chapter 293. The beautiful Lady Lu had always maintained an air of nobility in Fan Manor. But today she no longer cared about her appearance or her temperament. Her face was pale and she could not bear it. She hugged her master's legs and cried, Master, please say something. Jir is still young, he can't take such a beating. Minister Fan looked at the woman in front of him and could not help but sigh. After the death of Fan Jian's first wife, Lady Lu had followed him. Back then, Fan Jian had been given the title of Count Sinan, but the emperor's favor was hidden in the shadows. Lady Lu was the granddaughter of the duke, and yet she had married him, a member of the Fan family. Who knew how many people in the capital were shocked? After their marriage, Lady Lu took good care of him, caring for him, and forcibly pulled him back from Lujing River. So no matter how you looked at it, he had a feeling for Lady Lu and he felt sorry for her. Furthermore, the person being beaten in that study was his own son. Minister Fan was not young anymore, how could he not feel sorry for him? But no matter what he was thinking, he maintained a good expression on his face. He shook his head and scolded, Jade that is not polished is worthless. It is the fault of the father that the child is not taught. A loving mother spoils the child. At that moment there was another cry from the study. It was Fan Xija crying for his mother in pain. Fan Jian's eyebrows twitched and his heart twitched. He could no longer say the words of admonishment that he had been about to say. Lady Lu saw that her master had remained silent, and her tearful eyes showed her determination. She straightened her slightly disheveled dress and prepared to turn around and leave the study. Come back. Fan Jian scolded her in a low voice. Fan Xian is the eldest brother. It is only right for him to teach Xija a lesson. What will the child think if you run over now? What will the child think? Lady Lu turned around, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, you only think about what Fan Xian thinks but not what I think? I only have one precious son. Do you have the heart to watch him be beaten to death? She bit her lower lip and cried hoarsely, That's right, I did make mistakes in the past, but after he came from Danzhou, I tolerated everything and was careful and cautious, afraid that he would be unhappy. Based on what you said, I went around trying to bribe the nobles in the capital, afraid that I would drag the young master down. After all, his position in the capital is partly due to me. Of course, as a mother, it is natural for me to do these things and I would not go to him to ask for credit, but what is happening now? How could he bear to be so heavy-handed? If he still remembers what happened back then, I'll just return this life to him. Don't touch my son. My son. Fan Jian looked at Lady Lu's sobbing appearance, and a wave of anger rose to his chest. He scolded, What is this? Do you not know what kind of person Fan Xian is? Since he has let go of this matter, he will not pick it up again. Although he is young, he has a big heart. Xija went too far with what he did. If you don't teach him a lesson, he will drag the whole family down with him in the future. Will you be satisfied with that? Lady Lu was not an ordinary woman, and now that she knew the Baoyu brothel had been raided, she immediately knew that this had something to do with the struggle between the young master of the Fan family and the second prince. She wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes and said, It was not a big deal. It was just that the second prince had a hold on it, and that is why Fan Xian is angry. This woman and her son had the same judgment about Fan Xian's anger. Fan Jian's face darkened and he said, Not a big deal? It's not like you didn't see the things that were sent to the study in the back. Xia is so young, and yet he is so ruthless. Although he did not do it himself, what difference does it make? Do you think your son has to do it himself for it to be a big deal? Lady Lu couldn't help but speak up for her son, and she said, "Isn't there a lot of things like this in the capital? Who hasn't had this kind of trouble?" Before she could finish, Fan Jian cut her off and coldly said, "Don't talk about this anymore." Madame Lu obediently stopped talking, but the tear stains at the corners of her eyes had disappeared. Her eyes were still brimming with tears. The cries of pain and agony from the distant study gradually subsided. Instead, it made her, as his mother, even more frightened. Had she fainted or something? Fan Jian looked at her and couldn't help but sigh. He thought about what he had discussed with Fan Xian the night before, and his heart felt a little dark. In fact, over the past few months, Fan Xian had heard of Fan Xija's business in the capital, but he didn't care much about it. He thought it was a child's business, and what could he do? He didn't expect that even as a father, he had underestimated Fan Xija's abilities and methods. Let Fan Xian handle it. Fan Jian comforted Lady Lu and said, "You should understand this. The more he doesn't try to avoid suspicion, the more it shows that he really sees Xia as his own brother. That child Fan Xian can even smile at his enemies. The reason why he is so tyrannical today is because he loves Xia. If it wasn't someone close to him, he would have just killed him. Why would he be so angry? Now that you understand this, you should be at ease. To tell you the truth, you know very well who our family can rely on in the future." Lady Lu understood this, of course. Fan Xian's reputation was too great, and they were riding a tiger. They could only go up but not down. Fan Jian was getting on in years. He might not leave this world, but there would come a day when he would retire. Whether it was Lady Lu or Xia, what kind of fortune they would have, and whether or not this manor would be safe for the rest of their lives, all depended on how the young master of the manor did in this country. But no matter what, Lady Lu would always feel some resentment towards Fan Xian. Fan Jian shook his head, and motioned for her to follow him out of the study. They walked towards the study next to the garden in the back of the manor. Lady Lu was overjoyed and hurriedly followed. Even the servant girls behind her, who were holding hot towels, didn't care to discipline them and waved them away. Turning here and there, the servants could only watch as their master and mistress walked through the manor so quickly. They couldn't help but feel a little surprised, but then they thought of the pig being slaughtered, that came from the front and back of the manor. They suddenly understood and began to feel uneasy. They thought that the young master had beaten the second young master so badly. If the master and mistress hurried over, wouldn't they start a fight? Things had been going smoothly for Fan Xian for the past few years, and the atmosphere in the manor had been very serious and lively. The servants had a strong sense of belonging, and they really didn't want anything to happen in the manor. Lady Lu hurried towards the garden with a face full of panic. She wanted to grow a pair of wings and fly over, but seeing her master's calm and broad back as usual, she didn't dare to be first. Just as she reached the entrance to the garden, which connected the front and back of the manor, she heard another wretched cry from the garden. The sound of countless wooden planks falling on flesh rang out, and it was a frightening sound. Lady Lu's mind was in a mess. Suddenly hearing this sound, she couldn't tell if it was her precious son who was crying. A wave of sadness rose up in her chest, and with a cry, she fainted. Fortunately, the servant girls behind her didn't dare to leave because of her rebuke. They followed behind her obediently, and only then were they able to support the trembling mistress. The quietest of the 3 study rooms was in a secluded place next to the rockery. It was where Fan Xian conducted his household affairs, and it had always been forbidden for servants to approach. At this moment there were 3 people sitting in the study. Sitting behind the desk was Sir Yen Jr., who had just been appointed to the 4th Bureau, Yen Bingyun. Sitting to his right was Fan Xian's student, Shi Chanli, and the bookkeeper of the 1st Bureau, Mu Tai. Aside from Teng Zijing and Deng Ziyu, who were supervising the execution in the garden, these 3 were Fan Xian's confidants. Yen Bingyun's position was naturally the most special. He was Fan Xian's superior, and they had a faint friendship. At this moment, he frowned as he listened to the clattering of the wooden planks in the garden. He couldn't help but shake his head. Something that should be sent to the capital government should not be punished at home. It is against the law of the Qin kingdom. It is against the law of the Qin kingdom. Among the 3 of them, only he dared to question Fan Xian's decision. Shi Chanli laughed and explained to Sir Yen Jr., "We can't make a big deal out of this right now. If we really do send this to the capital government, and they find out that the second young master and the one in the palace, there will be no turning back. The commissioner will have to fight the second prince. But regardless of whether he wins or loses, the second young master of the Fan family will not have a good ending. Based on the evidence that the capital government has, even if they don't sentence him to death, they will at least send him 3,000 miles south. Mu Tai smiled awkwardly, not daring to respond. After all, he was the one who had warned Fan Xian about the Baoyu brothel. In other words, he was the one who had caused the second young master of the Fan family to end up like this. Although Fan Xian was very pleased with his performance, who knew what the majority of the Fan family thought? Yan Bingyun shook his head again. It was clear that he didn't approve of Fan Xian's decision to use the family law to replace the national law. But he also knew that this was the only thing he could do. He couldn't help but mock him and say, "This commissioner of ours? He really is a man with a crystal heart. Even if the Baoyu brothel case comes to light in the future, he will have something to say in front of the emperor. At least if the second prince wants to investigate the Fan family for not being strict enough and allowing his brother to commit murder, it will be impossible." Shi Chanli was shocked to hear this. He knew that Fan Xian had made this punishment known to the entire manor in order to get the news out and shut the mouths of the imperial censors. But Fan Xizha had committed a crime and this was not going to work. Yan Bingyun smiled and looked at him, knowing what he was worried about. He said, "Don't worry about it. Your teacher has already made arrangements." Shi Chanli thought to himself that this matter had nothing to do with the Fourth Bureau. If Fan Xian was summoned here, then he must have made some sort of arrangement. But it wasn't convenient for him to continue asking. Mu Tai walked to the window and looked at the garden from afar. His buttocks were shaking and his flesh was split open and blood was spilled. Even though he was an official of the Overwatch Council, he couldn't help but be shocked by Fan Xian's ruthlessness. Seeing the children of the Fan and Lu families suffering under the punishment, he couldn't help but touch his own buttocks. Shi Chanli once again busied himself with copying some documents that he was about to use. Lady Lu woke up and was about to fight Fan Xian to the death. She rubbed her eyes and realized that the people being beaten in the garden were her good-for-nothing relatives. Although the punishment was cruel and blood was splashing high into the air, and the children were crying out in pain, as long as it wasn't her own children suffering, Lady Lu had no objections. She returned to her noble and dignified demeanor as Lady Fan and looked at the scene coldly. In the woman's heart, her son Fan Xizha was capable of causing trouble on a small scale, but he had stirred up so many scandals in the capital. It was obvious that he had been seduced by evil spirits. The children and nephews of her maternal family, the members of the Fan clan, were naturally the main culprits. The more she watched, the angrier she became. Ignoring the cries for help from her maternal relatives, she gritted her teeth and yelled at Teng Zijing's bodyguards, "The young master told you to hit them, so hit them hard. If you don't cure these little bastards, how can you vent your anger?" As they spoke, the couple entered the study. As soon as they saw Fan Xizha lying on the bench in the corner of the room, his lower body naked, Madame Lu immediately panicked and threw herself at him. She looked at the bloody marks on her son's back and buttocks with heartache. She couldn't help but quietly cry. Her fingers carefully stroked the swollen bruises from the rod. "My son?" A hand reached out with a handkerchief to wipe away the tears on her face. Lady Lu looked and saw that it was Fan Xian. She gritted her teeth. She didn't show any resentment, but she still couldn't help but feel a hidden bitterness. Fan Xian had already regained his composure. After the vicious beating, his anger had been mostly vented. He comforted her. "It's nothing. Step aside. I'll apply medicine for my brother." Lady Lu reluctantly stepped aside and watched as Fan Xian applied the medicine to Fan Xizha's body. By this time, Fan Xizha was out of breath from the beating. He was on the verge of death and could faint at any moment. Fan Jian looked to the side. His daughter-in-law and daughter were standing obediently in the corner. Wanner's eyes were filled with fear. The beating that had just taken place must have been frightening. Ruoro's eyes were filled with tears, not because of the pain her brother had suffered, but because of her brother's incompetence. He shook his head and coughed. Drawing everyone's attention, he asked Fan Xian evenly, "How are the arrangements?" "According to your wishes, Xizha will leave tonight," Fan Xian said respectfully. "It has already been arranged." Chapter 294. The conversation between the father and son continued as if no one else was present. The three women who were listening were dumbfounded. Was it not enough to beat Fan Xizha to such a state? Was he going to be exiled from the capital? "Master, what did you say?" Lu Shi's eyes were wide with fear, and she looked at her master helplessly. Fan Xizha, who had been lying on the bench, had already leapt up from it. She did not know how he could still be so strong given his injuries. It looked as if being exiled from the capital was a terrifying thing for all the nobles in the capital. Fan Xija's butt was in the air and he was hugging his mother's legs. He squeezed his eyes and a few drops of tears rolled down his cheeks, competing with the pockmarks on his face. His mouth was wide open, but before he could say anything, he had been hit so hard that he lost his voice. He anxiously opened his mouth but nothing came out. The young man's tears were bright, and he shook his head furiously, unable to speak. His back was covered in blood and he looked very pitiful. Master. Lu Shi couldn't take it anymore and she looked at Fan Xian with resentment. She was like a tree that had been cut in half, and she knelt in front of Fan Xian. She cried and begged, "No. You can't. He is your precious son. Can you bear to see him be kicked out of the house? Can you bear to see him wander in a foreign country without any family?" She quickly grabbed Fan Roro's hand and said, "Roro, quick, ask your father for mercy. Don't kick Xija out of the house." Lu Shi thought that using the incident at the Baoyu house to kick Fan Xija out of the house must have been Fan Xian talking behind their backs. Last night the father and son had talked for a long time, so she quickly pulled Ruoruo into the fray. She thought that although Ruoruo was not her own daughter, they had lived together for over 10 years. She loved Fan Xija and everyone knew that Fan Xian loved his sister the most. Fan Ruoruo did not expect her brother to receive such a heavy punishment. She was pulled by Lu Shi and she knelt down. Her voice trembled as she said, "Father, my brother has been taught a lesson. He will not do it again. Please forgive him this time." Wan stood by the side alone. Her heart was slightly flustered and she hurriedly knelt down. Fan Jian remained calm until his daughter-in-law, who had a special status, knelt down as well. Only then did he help her up. He frowned at Lady Lu and said, "Xija must go, and don't blame Fan Xian. This is what I want." Madame Lu looked at him in disbelief, wondering why he was doing this. However, she knew very well that Fan Jian was a man with a gentle and upright appearance, but in reality he had the air of a great general and a murderous aura. Otherwise she wouldn't have fallen in love with him at first sight and refused to marry him. Since this was his idea, he would definitely not change it. She was a shrewd woman. Biting her lip, she turned around and bowed to Fan Xian. Weakly she pleaded, "Young master, please say something to persuade the master." At this moment, the only person who could make Fan Jian withdraw his intention of exiling Fan Xija was Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not want to accept her bow, and he quickly avoided it. With a bitter smile, he looked at his father, asking for his opinion. Fan Jian coldly shook his head and said, "His crime today, if the imperial censor were to report it to the court, he would be exiled for 3,000 miles. I will kick him out of the capital, and that will be better than the court taking action." Madame Lu did not believe this. With Fan Xian's current power and influence, even if Fan Xian were to open a brothel and kill a few prostitutes, as long as it was not a crime of treason, Fan Jian and Fan Xian would be able to suppress it. She could not help but cry, "Master, how could you be so cruel? Xija, he is only 14. If I am not cruel, then this would happen." Fan Jian coldly laughed at himself. 14? Don't forget, when Fan Xian was 12 years old, he was already forced to kill, he yelled harshly. As soon as he said this, the entire room was silent. Lin Wan'er and Fan Ruoruo, who did not know about this, looked at Fan Xian in shock. Madame Lu, who had always been tied down by this matter, was frightened and lowered her head in despair. Fan Xian laughed awkwardly. He knew that it was not convenient for him to say anything more. He carefully picked up Xija, who was covered in wounds, and retreated to a corner. He then ordered his wife and sister to carry his brother into the bedroom so that he could rest. Fan Xian, come back later. Fan Jian looked at Madame Lu and walked out of the study. Only Madame Lu and Fan Xian were left in the study, and the atmosphere was a little awkward. After a while, Madame Lu opened her eyes and said, "Are you really going to kick him out of the capital?" Fan Xian sighed and walked closer to her. He lowered his voice and comforted her, "Do not worry. Father only wants Xija to leave the capital for a while. He wants to train outside." Before he could finish, Madame Lu suddenly asked, "How far will he go?" "Very far." Fan Xian looked at the absent-minded Madame Lu and thought that such a shrewd woman was worried about her son. He was suddenly confused and for a moment he envied Fan Xija. He missed someone. "How far?" Madame Lu asked in a shrill voice. Fan Xian did not care about her attitude at this time. He said calmly, "Father decided it last night. I wanted to persuade him to send Xija to Danzhou to hide, but he was worried that grandmother would not be able to do it, so he changed it to Northern Qi." Northern Qi? Madame Lu felt a little more at ease. Although northern Qi was far away, it was not like the southern barbarians or the western barbarians that the court had exiled. It was much more prosperous and safe. Although northern Qi and Qing did not get along, after the peace treaty, the two countries were currently in a honeymoon period, and their relationship was excellent. Fan Xian looked at Madame Lu's pleading eyes and knew what she was thinking. He comforted her. Do not worry. I have many friends in northern Qi. I will take good care of him. The moon peeked out from the other side of the autumn tree. Compared to the bright lights of Fan Manor, it was much dimmer. The sons and nephews of the Fan and Lu families, who had been beaten up in the garden, were taken away by carriages from Shangshu Alley and other places. When the relatives of the Fan family saw the wretched state of their sons, they felt pain in their hearts. Their gazes toward Fan Manor were filled with a bit of hatred. But because of the power of the Fan family, no one dared to curse. In the study, Fan Xian was standing next to his father, mixing fruit berries for him. That night, Madame Lu stayed by Fan Xija's bedside and did not leave his side. The fruit berries that Minister Fan drank every night had to be seasoned by Fan Xian himself. The 3 people I mentioned to father have already been sent to the capital government. The 3 people he mentioned were all people who had committed murder in the Baoyu brothel. He looked at his father and spoke with concern. The capital government is under the second son's control. I don't think they expected us to send them to the capital government. But those 3 people have been involved in murder cases, which means they are important people who want to take down Fan Xija. I think they will be picked up by the second son's people tonight. Fan Jian laughed and said, Don't hide it from me. I know you won't be so careless. I will take care of it. Fan Xian laughed as well. This time he had finally used all of the power Qin Pingping had given him, and he had mobilized the assassins of the 6th Bureau. They committed a crime punishable by death, but I think there will be repercussions from within the family. I will need you to make an appearance. Fan Jian knew what he was worried about. In the capital, there had never been an official who would harm a member of their own family. He shook his head and said, What is there to make an appearance for? We have sent them to the capital government. What does that have to do with us? Fan Xian heard this and was impressed. After thinking for a while he said, Xija, we will leave tonight. I will let Yin Bingyun take care of this. There shouldn't be any traces left behind. Fan Jian nodded and said, I have nothing to do with the people of northern Qi. Back in the day I killed too many of them. Are you sure you can handle this? Fan Xian met his father's gaze and knew that he was worried about Fan Xija's safety. He nodded solemnly and said, Wang Qinian is now in Shangjing and I have a good relationship with Haitang and the Emperor of Northern Qi. Xija should be fine in Shangjing. Fan Jian sighed, and the white frost on his mane was particularly eye-catching tonight. He said, You used to tell me that Xija was talented, and that he didn't have to study to become an official. I listened to you, but I didn't think this child would be more radical than you and I thought. He started doing this at the age of 14. What was I doing when I was 14? I was still studying with the Crown Prince in King Cheng's manor, now the Emperor. All I thought about was how to have fun. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, Yi Guiping's 3rd son is really something. He became the owner of a brothel at the age of 8. If this gets out, it will be recorded in the annals of Qing history. His name will go down in history. As for Yi Guiping, I will talk to her. Fan Jian shook his head. Although Xija is talented, he is still too superficial. Going down the path of evil is not a long-term solution. This time, I will take this opportunity to let him go out and see the world. First, I will punish him, and second, I hope that he will be able to become a useful person. Fan Xian sighed and said, I have my own problems. Don't blame yourself. Fan Jian waved his hand and had him sit down. When it happened you weren't in the capital, but I am curious. Why did you seem so at ease when I suggested sending Xija to Northern Qi? You should know that Northern Qi does not treat the people of Qing well. Fan Xian did not speak of the wordless agreement he had made with Haitang and the young emperor, but he did explain his thoughts. He smiled and said, Xinjiang has been using the Cui family to smuggle goods into Northern Qi. Now that Xinjiang is dead, there have been some problems with their routes. I think that if Xija can be trained in the north in a few years, perhaps he will have the opportunity to take over the Cui family's business. After all, he likes it. Since he wants to do business, I want to arrange a bigger business for him to do. Fan Jian smiled and looked at his son with satisfaction. Fan Xian's thoughts could be considered meticulous. Compared to Fan Jian and Qin Pingping's generation, he was only a little less ruthless. When do you plan to move against the Cui family? Seeing his father so easily point out his plan, Fan Xian did not feel the slightest bit uneasy. He smiled and said, "It will be after I take over the palace treasury. Around March or April next year." Fan Jian nodded and suddenly said with a gloomy face, "Don't give them any chance to retaliate." This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his father's honest and kind face reveal a ruthless side. His heart trembled and he responded in a low voice. Fan Jian continued to speak in a cold voice, "You have handled this matter well. Temporary tolerance can buy you time to react. After Xia leaves, do what you want to do. Don't ask for my opinion. But there is someone, Yuan Meng? Is that her name?" Fan Jian suddenly said, "She does things shrewdly and her style is sinister. In a few days when this matter has died down you can get rid of her. That will be the end of those cases." Fan Xian was shocked. He did not know if his father had killed Yuan Meng to avenge Xia, or if it was for some other reason. Fan Jian's next words revealed this minister's deepest humanism and his long-hidden spirit of universal love. He said coldly, "I grew up in Lujing River and I have always cherished flowers. What I hate the most are those who destroy them. Furthermore, this Yuan Meng was a woman from a brothel, and yet she was willing to lay her hands on a weak woman of the same profession. I cannot allow such a person to exist in this world." Fan Xian suddenly understood. He remembered that King Jing often teased him, and remembered that his father used to be a brothel guest. Those stories of his love affairs were still being spread throughout the capital. Seeing the tragic deaths of the prostitutes in the case file had touched his sensitive spot. No wonder he could not tolerate Yuan Meng. He took the opportunity to say, "Yuan Meng is Hongqing's? Do you think about Hongqing and his sister's marriage?" Without waiting for him to finish, Fan Jian shook his head and said, "Hongqing is a good child. Let's keep an eye on him for a few more days. After all, this is a marriage arranged by the emperor. We need to be careful." Fan Xian was disappointed, and he was angry that his father did not care about Ruoruo's happiness. He wondered if Ruoruo was not as good as the women in the brothel. Fan Xian made up his mind. Even without his father's help, he was going to continue. He left the study room and entered it again. The three people in the study room saw him enter, and they all stood up to greet him. Shi Chanli handed over a document with dried ink and said, "This is the agreement for the transfer of 70% of the shares of the Baoyu house. Please take a look and then the second master will sign it." Mu Tai continued, "The capital government has been keeping an eye on us. According to the information sent back by our spies, the capital government is troubled by the murder suspects we sent to them." Later, a servant from the second prince's side went to the capital government's manor. "We don't know what they discussed." Fan Xian nodded and said, "It doesn't matter. We won't be doing anything for the next few days." Mu Tai frowned and said, "What if they misjudge the situation and think we are going to fight to the death? What if they send the capital government to arrest the second master?" Fan Xian looked at Yan Bingyun, who had been silent this entire time. He shook his head and said, "With the boss of the 4th Bureau here, if Fan Xia goes north, who will be able to find him?" Chapter 295. After everything had been arranged, Fan Xian went to the bedroom. Lu Shi was lying on the edge of the bed, and it looked as if she had fallen asleep. He quietly woke her up and they whispered to each other for a while. Lu Shi's tear-stained face gradually revealed a look of determination. She nodded and accepted this arrangement. She didn't know what Fan Xian had promised her, or how he had convinced her. It was getting late, and the insects in the garden had long since stopped chirping. Ruoruo was accompanying Lu Shi. Fan Xian walked over to the side of his sleepy little brother, and looked at his face, which was still gritting his teeth in hatred. He looked at the pockmarks that were about to burst out, and he couldn't help but smile and shake his head. He took the ink from the desk and took out the document that Shi Chanli had prepared. He pressed Xia's fingers onto the document. Seeing the bright red fingerprints on the snow-white document, Fan Xian nodded with satisfaction. From now on, the 70% of the shares that Xia owned in the Baoyu house were now officially transferred to someone else's hands. He was no longer associated with the brothel, which was filled with blood and bones. Wan knew that he was in a bad mood and she made a face at him. But she didn't get any response. Deep in her heart, she couldn't help but feel a little useless. She smiled. Fan Xian also smiled and said, "This has nothing to do with you. Children need to go out and try their luck." He suddenly asked, "Has Miss Shun been brought back?" "She is in the West Pavilion." Wan explained, "Mr. Yin has already gone there." Good. Fan Xian calmly agreed, and then he sat down next to Xia's bed. He thought for a moment and then stood up again. He called for the kitchen staff to make some food, and then he sat down in the side room and picked up a bowl of hot porridge. He blew on it and slowly drank it. He wanted to give Yan and Miss Shen some time to reminisce. More importantly, he wanted to give Lu Shi some time to be alone with her son. He didn't know how much time had passed, but Deng Ziyu was led by a servant. He nodded at Fan Xian. Fan Xian understood. He didn't want anyone else to help him, so he walked into the bedroom and personally carried Fan Xizha to the back of the courtyard through the corner gate. He then climbed into the carriage. Fan Xizha was still in a daze. Lady Lu bit her lip and stroked his cheek affectionately, but he did not wake up. Ruoro also stroked his thick ears with reluctance. Even Wan'er's eyes flashed with a hint of sadness at the separation. Only Count Sinan, Fan Jian, continued to sleep peacefully, as if he did not care about his youngest son at all. He was about to leave for a foreign country and did not know when he would return. "You guys go first," Fan Xian said to the icy-faced Yan Bingyun. "I'll have to trouble your father with this matter. Be careful when you leave the city." After nightfall, the gates of Jingdo were closed. Only the people of the Overwatch Council had the power to silently send a person out of the city. Yan Bingyun slowly raised his head, glanced at him and asked, "You're not coming?" Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "We'll meet at Songlin Bao. I still have some things to do." From the corner of his eyes, he could clearly see that his brother had tears in the corners of his eyes. He had clearly woken up, but he did not know why he had pretended to be unconscious in front of Lady Lu. Fan Xizha's lips twitched. He must have hated Fan Xian and his father. In the darkness, besides the Qinian unit, there were also swordsmen from the 6th Bureau on standby. Based on the strength of this group, unless the second prince mobilized the Yi family's forces in the capital, there was no way they could face them head-on. Fan Xian stood below the carriage with his head lowered for a moment, then waved his hand. The carriage slowly began to move, heading out of the capital. Behind them, the three women who stood by the back door of Fan Manor couldn't help but look sorrowful. Lady Lu's sorrow was even greater. The unmarked carriages traveled through the quiet, dark streets of the capital. Yan Bingyun had used some unknown method to leave the city without a hitch. They stepped onto the official road outside the city and traveled northwest for half an hour. Using the moonlight, they saw that there was a small mountain in front of them, and they arrived at Songlin Bao. The carriages stopped there waiting for Fan Xian. Fan Xizha, who was in the carriage, suddenly opened his eyes at this moment. His eyes were still filled with ruthlessness. "Aren't you afraid that I'll run away during this exile journey?" There were only him and Yan Bingyun in the carriage. Yan Bingyun coldly said, "You're a smart man. Of course you know what to do. Fan Xian has used so many methods for your sake. Of course it's not just to ensure your safety." Fan Xizha lowered his voice and cursed, "It's to protect his own reputation." Yan Bingyun mockingly replied, "If it was just to protect his own reputation, he could have sent you directly to the capital government. Who could say anything about it?" Fan Xizha knew this was the case, but he refused to admit it. In a shrill voice he said, "That's because father would not allow such a thing to happen." "The minister?" Yan Bingyun's cold eyes had an additional trace of mockery. "The minister's thoughts are not something that young people like you and I can think about." Fan Xizha weakly said, "Brother Yan, where does my brother want me to go?" "Northern Qi," Yan Bingyun replied. "Ah." Fan Xizha's face showed a look of despair. He let out a long sigh, and then fell to the ground in a manner that did not match his age. He lay down, but when he touched the wound on his back, he couldn't help but let out a scream. Yan Bingyun looked at him, amused. "Fan Xian's medicine, although effective, it is very overbearing. You should continue to endure it." Back when he was in Shangjing, Northern Qi, he had been tormented by Fan Xian in the same way. "I know what I'm doing. It looks terrible, but I haven't broken any bones. Why are you acting pitiful?" Fan Xian spoke coldly, and with a cold face he walked into the carriage. Fan Xizha looked at the expression on Yan Bingyun's face, and thought of the punishment he had received earlier. "What are you doing?" Yan Bingyun frowned and looked at him. "Time is of the essence." Fan Xian put down the person he was carrying on his back and threw her next to Fan Xizha. Suddenly the carriage was filled with a faint fragrance. Fan Xizha was shocked. Looking at the woman's soft face, he was shocked. He shouted at Fan Xian, "What did you do to her?" The woman that Fan Xian had captured was the Baoyue brothel's most popular prostitute, Yan. Fan Xian looked at Fan Xizha and laughed mockingly. "You pity her that much? It looks like you have inherited your father's good genes. When you opened the brothel, why didn't you show some mercy?" Fan Xizha and Yan Bingyun did not understand the word jeans, but they were curious as to why Fan Xian had captured this woman. Of course, with Fan Xian's skills in the use of drugs, and the fact that the Baoyue brothel was in a state of panic, it would have been easy for him to kidnap a prostitute. Is she your first woman? Fan Xian looked into his brother's eyes and softly asked. Fan Xizha thought for a while and nodded. His eyes looked pitiful and he begged his brother to let the woman go. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. You are indeed stronger than me. 14 years old and you already had your bud. He then laughed out loud and said seriously, I know your attitude toward this woman is different from others. I also found out that she still has some affection for you, although you are only old enough to be her younger brother. Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. The Baoyue brothel will not be peaceful in the future. If Yan were to remain there, I don't think you would feel at ease. I will not bring her back to the manor. Even if my father allowed it, Auntie Lu would have killed her. Fan Xian calmly said, after thinking about it, your journey up north, although it was meant to be a trial, it was far too lonely. It would not be good for your temperament. So, I brought her with me to accompany you. Fan Xizha and Yan Bingyun's eyes opened wide. They were full of disbelief. He was being exiled from the capital, and he was bringing a popular prostitute with him? Was this an exile or was this a vacation? Brother, what are you trying to do? Fan Xizha did not believe that after all the trouble he had caused, he would still be able to enjoy the privileges that even the second young master of the Fan Manor could not enjoy. He spoke with a stutter and he looked at Fan Xian's calm face in fear. He even forgot about the pain he was feeling. Yan Bingyun looked at Fan Xian and felt very confused. He shook his head and patted Fan Xizha's shoulder, saying, Your brother is a wonderful man. He got off the carriage and left the carriage for the two brothers. After a short silence, Fan Xian quietly looked at Xizha and said, Why didn't you say goodbye to your mother? Without waiting for him to answer, he asked, Do you know why I am so angry this time? Why did father and I decide to send you away? Fan Xizha lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, Sending me away? I don't have to worry about the capital government handling the Baoyue brothel case. Even if I run away to avoid punishment, I don't have to worry about that. That way my family can go and fight with the second son. Correct. Fan Xian was pleased to find that his brother, under his influence, had begun to refer to the princes as the second son and the third son. Secondly, it is my punishment. Fan Xizha suddenly raised his head and endured the pain in his buttocks. He cried and said, But I don't want to go. Brother, the people of Northern Qi Kingdom are very fierce. What can I do there? Do what? Fan Xian very seriously replied, Do what you are best at, of course. Do business. Fan Xizha raised his head stupidly. He did not look like the owner of the Baoyue brothel at all. He asked, Do business? Yes. Fan Xian said, Father asked me to make some arrangements. I thought about it and I decided to leave you 1,000 liang of silver. When you arrive in Shangjing, I will send someone to pick you up. But I will not give you any extra help. If you can, within 5 months, turn this 1,000 liang of silver into 10,000, then I will truly acknowledge your ability. And then, 10 times? Before his brother could finish, Fan Xizha could not help but shout, I am not a god. That is your problem, Fan Xian said. 1,000 liang of silver is too little. Fan Xizha was both embarrassed and angry. This business is embarrassing. What kind of *T logic is this? When we opened Dambo bookstore, how much money did we spend? Bah. If you have the ability, then go and sell Story of the Stone. I promise I can turn 1,000 into 10,000. You wish. That guy with the surname Chow has already been driven crazy by me. Where else can he go? After the two brothers yelled at each other, the atmosphere became a little more relaxed. Fan Xian looked at Fan Xizha's chubby face and sighed. It is very windy out there. Father told me not to take too much care of you. You must be careful. Fan Xizha silently nodded and suddenly said, Brother, you said I am a genius at business. Do not worry. Fan Xian then said, I hope you do not blame me for chasing you out of the capital. Fan Xizha shook his head and did not say anything. Fan Xian knew he must be feeling very uncomfortable, so he frowned and said, Actually, the 2 reasons you gave me to get you out of the capital were false. Fan Xizha raised his head and looked very confused. Fan Xian quietly said, Even if you stay in the capital, what is there to be afraid of? Don't tell me I can't even protect you? I can just hide somewhere and wait for this to die down. I don't think the second prince would dare do anything to me. Even if the capital government were to investigate the Baoyue brothel, Would they dare to search the capital in front of the Fan family? As for the second reason, you said it was to punish you. That is only a small part of it. Fan Xian looked at the unconscious Baoyue brothel headliner and calmly said, "On this journey north, perhaps you will suffer a bit. But compared to the things you have done, it is really nothing. If I send you back to Danzhou, according to grandmother's way of doing things, I'm afraid you will be even more miserable." Fan Xizha was a little scared and pulled back his head. He did not dare make a sound because of the injury on his back. In his heart he was thinking, "Then why do you have to chase me north?" Fan Xian slowly lowered his eyelids and said, "I didn't think you would be so daring in doing things and so ruthless. If you remained in Jingdou for the sake of father and me, other people would always have this or that kind of honey to lure you into the deepest valley. Thus, I feel that it's better for you to experience some wind and rain outside. Perhaps it will be more beneficial for your growth." He suddenly looked at Fan Xizha coldly and said, "In business you must do whatever it takes. But there must be a certain degree of control. If you are too sharp and cruel, it is easy to get hurt. Besides, as a person, it is always good to be kind to others. You must always try to be on the bright side." In reality, Fan Xizha had never been very happy with the Baoyu brothel. After all, in his eyes, the Baoyu brothel was a symbol of his success. The dirty things that were hidden in it were not a big deal. He lay on the long carriage stool and said with a grunt, "These words are full of righteousness. Those who don't understand would think that my good brother has nothing to do with the Overwatch Council and is instead a wooden scholar of the Imperial College." His words were full of mockery, but Fan Xian only raised his eyebrows. He was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and his subordinates specialized in doing dark things. A mere brothel, regardless of whether it was in terms of the density of darkness and filth, or in terms of the level of cruelty, was a world of difference. It was no wonder that his brother did not think much of his discipline. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Do you think that I have always stood on the wrong side, and to use these words to talk about you is absurd?" Fan Xizha saw his brother smile warmly and began to panic again. He did not dare say anything, but his black eyes rolled. It was clear that this was what he meant. "Of course I am not a saint. I am not even a good person," Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, "But even if it was a murderous butcher, if he truly cherished his family, presumably he would have the same thoughts as me. In our line of work, even if we reek of blood, we still want our brothers to be pure and clean. Perhaps it is because we have come into contact with the most evil things in the world, so we hope you can stay away from these things." Fan Xizha heard him say "we" over and over again, and he was suspicious. Fan Xian thought for a moment, and then quietly told the story of Xiao En and Zhuang Mohan. He smiled and said, "Xiao En has killed many people in his life and done many evil things, but he still wanted to raise his brother to be a good man. In reality he succeeded. Zhuang Mohan did not disappoint him. Until the night before his death, I still admire him. Although your brother is not very talented, I want to do what Xiao En did." He seemed to be trying to convince his brother, but it also seemed like he was trying to comfort himself. "It is good to be a good person. I want to be a good person too." This was the first time Fan Xizha had heard of such a shocking secret. His mouth was wide open and he was speechless for a long time. After a long time he said in a trembling voice, "But, when I look at Master Zhuang's historical collections, I get a headache. Brother, if you want me to be a master, it will be too difficult." Fan Xian laughed angrily. "With a brain like yours, of course you won't be able to study." Fan Xizha didn't know what to say. "Then tell me this story, do your business well. In the future, you will strive to be a merchant whose name will go down in history." Fan Xian smiled encouragingly. "Merchants don't have to be as treacherous as people think. In this world, there are some merchants who walk the bright path and still succeed." Fan Xizha said foolishly, "Merchants focus on profit. You just need to make money. How can you go down in history? The bright path? Even if you succeed, you will still be a piece of fat meat in the mouths of the government. With me and my father, you can do business properly. Who would dare to do anything to you?" Fan Xian looked at him with calm and gentle eyes. "And have you forgotten about the Yi family? You told me on the Tsang Mountains that the reason you were interested in business since you were young was because when you were little, your father often told you about the Yi family's power and influence. If the mistress of the Yi family hadn't died, not to mention the government, even the big countries in the world wouldn't have dared to do anything to the Yi family." Fan Xizha's eyes lit up, but they immediately dimmed. "The brothel business is very profitable. It's more profitable than anything else." He still felt that in business, what was the point of saving face? Making money was the most important thing. Fan Xian smiled. I asked Big Yi of Qingyu Hall. He said that in the past the Yi family did all kinds of business, except for these unorthodox ones. First of all, the mistress of the Yi family's gender determined it. She must have hated this business. Second of all, Big Ye's explanation is that unorthodox. Since there's the word unorthodox, then even if you can make a lot of money in the end it's not the right way. It's like the green water beside a big river. Although it's deep and endless, it can't be vast and mighty. If you really want to be the best in business, just playing around in these small rivers won't do. For some reason, the more Fan Xian spoke, the more excited he became. Perhaps it had touched the softest part of his heart. He said in a clear voice, "It's not easy to live. Whatever you do, you have to do it to the extreme. Then you can't be satisfied with being an unscrupulous merchant, and you can't be satisfied with being an official merchant or even a royal merchant. The way of business still exists. You have to be a merchant of the world. Not only will you be rich enough to rival a country, but you will also be respected by the people, and your name will be remembered for generations to come." Fan Xian spoke slowly, but Fan Xizha felt a headache coming on. He looked at his brother helplessly and said, "The Yi family back in the day even sold firearms. They helped the Qin kingdom destroy Northern Wei. The people in the north didn't like them very much. We're talking about business, Baoyue brothel. I only used a few dirty tricks. Master Yuan only killed a few prostitutes, but the mistress of the Yi family has killed many innocent souls." "Big brother, what you're saying?" Fan Xian was at a loss for words. He waved his hand disinterestedly, stopping Fan Xizha from continuing to compare. He said, "In any case, bullying the weak is not very interesting." Fan Xizha suddenly looked worried and said, "Big brother, I really don't want to leave the capital." He then said, "Father and mother are in the capital, and I want you to be filial to them on my behalf." He knew that only if he left the capital would the Baoyue brothel incident truly die down. The weapon the second prince used to draw the Fan family to his side would disappear without a trace. Although Fan Xian would never admit this, seeing his father's decision, he knew that he had brought trouble to his family. And after hearing what Fan Xian had said, the 14-year-old boy felt a surge of desire. If he could reach the level of the mistress of the Yi family in this lifetime, how great would that be? Fan Xian nodded and agreed. He leaned over to his brother and whispered something into his ear. Finally, he told him about the people he could trust in Shangjing. Fan Xizha suddenly heard his brother's true intentions, and for a moment, he was stunned. The palace treasury, smuggling to the north, the Cui family, such a large amount of money, did he have the ability to do so? Chapter 296. Do you still remember last year when I beat up Guo Baoquan with an underground fist? The capital government wanted to hold me accountable? I remember. Do you still remember this year's spring examination case and the Ministry of Justice wanted to interrogate me? I remember. Fan Xizha glanced at him with some confusion. Was his brother saying this to remind him of the dignity of Qing law? But the problem was that these two cases ended without a conclusion. It only proved that in a place like the kingdom of Qing, power was still above the law. It was clearly a negative example. Fan Xian smiled and patted his butt. Both times you beat the officials with sticks in your hands. Although it was mainly because of your arrogant and domineering personality, you always have a sense of friendship toward me, a brother you've known for less than 2 years. I believe I'm not wrong about this. Fan Xizha's buttocks were full of scars. He bit his lower lip in pain and said, "Then why did you hit me so hard earlier?" Fan Xian smiled. "First of all, I'm really angry. I won't hide it from you. Second, if I don't beat you up badly, how can I make the people of Jingdo believe that the Fan family is still strict and strict? It's half acting and half real." Fan Xizha suddenly said in a daze, "Brother, such an important matter in the north, are you really leaving it to me?" Fan Xian replied, "Prove yourself first." Fan Xizha gritted his teeth and revealed a fanatical expression. He said with hatred, "Fine. I can definitely do it." Fan Xian nodded and looked at the sleeping prostitute of the Baoyue brothel by his brother's side. He raised his eyebrows and said, "Yesterday when we raided the building, I discovered that this woman has some affection for you. I am your brother, so of course I know that your heart is very hard and ruthless. But when it is time to be soft, you can be soft. Perhaps you will find that life will be much more interesting." After all, Fan Xizha was still young, and it was his first time experiencing the affairs between a man and a woman. His face flushed with embarrassment as he responded. The two brothers continued to talk in the carriage. At this moment the carriage came to a halt. The two of them knew that it was time to part ways. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "This trip will be difficult and dangerous. Although you must still feel resentment toward me, I think in the future you will understand my good intentions. As for father, don't feel any resentment. You have to know that in this world, other than parents and brothers, it is difficult for anyone to truly treat you well. You were chased out of Jingdo at such a young age. Naturally Aunt Lu is sad. I'm afraid father won't have it easy either." Fan Xizha nodded sadly. Watching Fan Xian's silhouette disembark from the carriage, he thought of the days to come. He couldn't help but feel empty in his heart. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he felt unspeakably uncomfortable. "Brother, bring me back soon." Fan Xian's figure stiffened as he got off the carriage. "Don't worry, I'll settle everything quickly." Watching the carriage slowly disappear into the night, Fan Xian could not help but feel a little absent-minded. He was not a good person, so why did he demand that Xizha be a good person? Perhaps his previous explanation was correct. The relationship between people was very delicate. Wang Jingwei did not want his son to be a traitor, and Hitler probably would have preferred his son to be a painter. Of course, these two did not have the opportunity to show Fan Xian, but he had seen the relationship between Xiao En and Zhuang Mohan, the two brothers, over the decades, and he deeply agreed with them. The legendary pair of brothers, Xiao En, had secretly done many things for Zhuang Mohan. No one knew, but he had always hidden himself in the dark. He cared about his brother's reputation and refused to acknowledge him. This was already a remarkable thing. When Zhuang Mohan was in his 70s or 80s, he was almost at the end of his rope. His personal reputation had reached the peak of his life. In order for his brother to escape, he did not hesitate to abandon his lifelong beliefs and come all the way to Qin Kingdom to frame Fan Xian. The price he paid was not as simple as it seemed. He completely abandoned what Zhuang Mohan treasured the most. Coincidentally, before these two influential figures passed away, Fan Xian was by their side. Fan Xian watched the carriage leave and sighed in his heart. He did not know whether or not Xizha would bear a grudge against him. He also did not know, in the distant future, if he were to one day sink into the darkness like Xiaoan, would Xizha be like Zhuang Mohan and risk everything to save him? The night wind blew over the hills outside the capital. Fan Xian shook his head in self-mockery. Given Xizha's personality, he would at most be willing to lose tens of thousands of taels of silver for him. If the amount of silver was a little more, that greedy and cruel little guy would have to reevaluate. Yan Bingyun stood beside him and suddenly said, "You are a very hypocritical person." Fan Xian asked with great interest, "Why do you say that? You use everyone around you, but you make it seem like you are doing it for their own good." The corners of Yan Bingyun's lips curled up slightly. Fan Xian replied calmly, "You don't have a brother, so you can't understand this kind of feeling. I really am doing it for his own good. Although my methods may have been a bit excessive, and the results may not have been good, but there is no other way. My experience can only go so far. At least, in the future, I can say to myself that I have done my part as a brother for Xizha's growth." That is the second point I wanted to make. Yan Bingyun nodded. "You are a very cruel person." Fan Xian was silent, knowing that Yan Bingyun would continue. "Young Master Fan is still young and the situation in the north is very complicated, and yet you were able to ruthlessly expel him from the capital and make him disappear, cutting off the possibility of others blackmailing you. It seems that even the second prince did not expect such a ruthless move," Yan Bingyun said coldly. There was no smile on Fan Xian's face. Instead he asked, "How do you think people should live their lives?" After Ruoruo, Xizha, and Wanhou, this was the fourth time Fan Xian had asked someone about Ostrovsky's eternal question. Yan Bingyun was slightly startled and shook his head. "My thinking is very simple. As an official of the Overwatch Council, I should be loyal to His Majesty, to the Kingdom of Qin, to make the country rich and powerful, and to unify the world." "Unify the world?" Fan Xian said sarcastically. "What is the point of that?" Yan Bingyun was startled again. As a member of the younger generation of the Kingdom of Qin, he had grown up in a time when the country's power was expanding rapidly. This kind of thinking was ingrained in his bones. He had never thought about why he wanted to unify the world, and no one had ever asked him about it. Now that Fan Xian had suddenly asked him this question, he did not know how to explain it. The world is divided into 3 parts, and there are many small countries in the middle. War is inevitable and the people are destitute. In that case, why not unify the world and get rid of the threat of war? After thinking for a while, he tried to sort out his thoughts. Fan Xian shook his head. "I have never believed in the power of the world. Divided for a long time, united for a long time, divided for a long time. United for a few hundred years, divided for another few hundred years. If the divided countries did not have the ambition to unify the world, then where would there be war? Unifying the world is not a way to get rid of war and bring peace. It is a fruit to tempt the people of the world to throw themselves into war. If everyone did not think this way, then wouldn't the world be at peace? Yan Bingyun glanced at him and mockingly said, "That is a very childish way of thinking." "I also understand." Fan Xian sighed. "But, when I am alive, I really do not want to see such things as war. In 1 year, the number of people who died at the hands of the council is about 400. In August, the Yangtze River broke its banks. I estimate tens of thousands of people have already died. If war truly starts in just a few months, I'm afraid hundreds of thousands of people will die. Even if the conflict can be temporarily suppressed, it cannot last. There will come a day when war breaks out." Yan Bingyun snorted disdainfully. "Even if you gather the 4 great grandmasters as fighters and forcefully suppress the ambitions of the royal family, what will happen after you die?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "After I die? After I die, even if the flood reaches the sky." Louis Xiv's most blatant declaration finally made Yan Bingyun's expression change. He shook his head and sighed. "I thought you were a benevolent person hiding in the darkness. After hearing what you said, only then do I realize that what I said just now was considered polite. Not only are you ruthless, but you are also an extremely selfish person. You misunderstood, didn't you? I told you last time I'm not a saint." Fan Xian suddenly frowned and teased him. "But now it looks like, it seems, there is no harm in being a saint." "A saint in charge of the Overwatch Council?" Yan Bingyun looked at him like he was looking at a ghost. "Then how do you plan to spend the rest of your life?" Yan Bingyun rarely asked a question like those people in Shangjing in northern Qi. "I plan to spend the rest of my life well." Fan Xian said this superfluous sentence. Without waiting for a response, he laughed and said, "This time Xia has gone north and I have troubled you and your father. To send a person through the entire Qing kingdom without anyone knowing, other than monitoring the movements of the officials in each county and the Overwatch Council, which controlled the foreign spy network, going easy everywhere or even stealing from within, it was truly impossible to do this." "You are my superior," Yan Bingyun replied directly. Fan Xian understood what he was thinking and said, "I will report this to the director." He continued, "Did you know? The last time the diplomatic mission left the capital, the first night they set up camp in this pine forest below us." He rubbed his nose and laughed at himself. "At that time, Sea Lily was in the diplomatic mission. Today Xia has been exiled. Although his situation is much worse than mine, I also captured a woman to accompany him. It seems that our journey will not be lonely." Yan Bingyun shook his head with a slight headache. It was difficult for him to get used to Fan Xian's shamelessness, which he only showed to his close subordinates and friends. So he asked, "Now that there is nothing to worry about, what do you plan to do?" Fan Xian laughed bitterly. "He is a prince. Do you really think we would dare to kill him?" Yan Bingyun coldly said, "I don't think there is anything you wouldn't dare to do." Fan Xian's heart jumped and he smiled and said, "It looks like you really do understand me. But there is no rush. First, I will ruin Hongqing's reputation. Then I will torture the second prince's men and force the Cui family into a corner. In the end," he quietly said, "I will no longer concern myself with the Baoyue brothel. You help Shi Chanli deal with it. As for what to do next, you are in charge. After all, when it comes to scheming, you are far more talented than I am." Chapter 297. The Baoyu brothel was still open for business. Although there were a few well-informed people who knew that the Fan family and the second prince had been fighting over the most popular brothel in the capital, the Fan family had only beaten the Baoyue brothel a little and did not have much of a reaction. The Overwatch Council did not make things difficult for the Baoyu brothel either, so everyone thought the matter was over. In the minds of these officials, this was a very natural outcome. After all, no matter how arrogant Fan Xian was, there was always a lot of taboo in front of a prince. Furthermore, in the eyes of the public, the second master of the Fan family was running the Baoyu brothel. Although it had damaged the reputation of the Fan family, he had earned a lot of money from it. If everyone worked together to suppress this matter, it would be a win-win situation. To the people of the capital who did not know what was going on, they only saw the Overwatch Council raiding the brothel and heard the beating of the wooden planks in Fan Manor. To them, there was something strange about the whole thing. When did the Emperor's Secret Service begin to manage the brothel? What had happened to the Fan family? Why had the little tyrants of the streets of the capital suddenly disappeared without a trace? But regardless of whether they knew about this matter or not, they all thought that this matter would be the same as the usual conflicts between influential officials in the capital. In the end, because of the invisible but dense network of relationships in the air, it would disappear without a trace. As the saying goes, good for you, good for me, and good for everyone. However, the managers, girls, and shopkeepers of the Baoyu brothel were not as relaxed as outsiders thought. This was because ever since the Overwatch Council raided the brothel, the big boss had not returned to the Baoyu brothel. It was as if he had disappeared. Although there were rumors that the young big boss was under house arrest, no one could rest easy without confirmation. Plus, the second boss had a special status, so he could not watch over the brothel every day. For a while, the Baoyu brothel maintained a calm appearance, but there was an undercurrent that was slowly flowing under the surface. On the other side of the undercurrent, the people of the second prince were also wondering why the Fan family had sent the people involved in the murder of the brothel to the capital government. Ever since Mei Zhili had changed positions, this important yamen had always been under the control of the second prince. The other party must have known that the capital government was within the scope of the second prince's power. If the Fan family was prepared to shed all pretense of cordiality and send the second young master to the authorities for investigation, then why was it that there was only news of the second young master being grounded? There was no sign of the Overwatch Council or the Fan family making a move. The second prince was having a headache over this matter. He had no idea that the Fan family would so decisively expel Fan Xizha from the capital and quietly send him to a foreign country. The Overwatch Council's work was flawless, but there was still a faint worry that prompted the second prince to begin making preparations. But now that things had come to a head, they realized that they had nothing to do with the Baoyu house. They were innocent. Even if they were to guard against Fan Xian's revenge, they did not know what Fan Xian could possibly do to them. So how could they guard against him? No one could grasp Fan Xian's thoughts. No one could guess Sir Yen Jr.'s ability to execute. On this day the wind was gentle and the clouds were light. The yellow leaves were falling, and it was a perfect day for a trip outside the capital. There were still 6 days until the day of the royal family's chrysanthemum viewing. The officials and commoners of the capital had all brought their families to the outskirts of the capital. Since it was still daytime, the Baoyu house was particularly quiet. Because the future was uncertain, and the owner was missing, the usually energetic receptionists were leaning against a pillar. The girls by the lake were forcing themselves to smile, and they were accompanying the old perverts who liked to indulge in daylight. Some unknown insects were hopping around the stone steps of the side corridor, crying out with all their might. They struggled to no avail, waiting for their end to come. The waiters in the building all looked a little uneasy. They picked up the rag and wiped the table. In the past, Fan Xizha had given strict orders that the table had to be tested with a white silk. They had to confirm that there was not a speck of dust on it before it passed. How could it be as easy as it was now? Suddenly someone walked in. This person's eyebrows were very thick, and they looked as if they had been painted on. Although this appearance was not out of the ordinary, it was very easy to remember. So, one of the receptionists who had received him one night immediately recognized him. He froze next to the door of the Baoyu house. His body sprung up, but he did not dare go forward to greet him. It was one of the waiters who looked at the receptionist strangely. He neatly put the gray rag in his hand on the table and sang, "A guest has arrived." The end of his voice was crisp and very pleasant to listen to. The person who came was slightly startled, and a wry smile appeared on his face. It seemed that there was a great deal of difficulty in his heart. He stood in the incomparably wide hall of the Baoyu house for a while. Finally, he could not help but shake his head and say, "Tell Si Qing to come see me." This time it was the waiter's turn to be shocked. He thought to himself that this guest was very arrogant. He wanted Si Qing to come see him personally, and he even called her by her name. There were many nobles in the capital, but of those who came to the Baoyu house, who did not treat Si Qing with respect. The receptionist who knew this person finally came to his senses. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and ran in front of the person. He respectfully said, "Sir, I will go and inform you immediately." He then asked the waiters to lead the person to the second floor of the third floor. It was the quietest room in the Baoyu house, and he ordered the waiters to take good care of him. When the person went upstairs, the waiters on the first floor surrounded him. They did not stop talking and they did not know which deity had come. The Baoyu house was currently in a state of turmoil, but the people's hearts were already wavering. The slightest movement would cause everyone to feel uneasy. Finally, someone remembered that this person with thick eyebrows, who looked like an ordinary scholar, was actually the companion of young Master Chin, who came to visit the prostitute that day. Who was Mr. Chin? It was the brother of the owner of the Baoyu house. It was Mr. Fan, the most popular person in the government. The person who had come was Mr. Fan's confidant, and it was likely that he was a high-ranking official in the Overwatch Council. Everyone in the brothel was stunned. They all knew what had happened that day. The brothel had offended Mr. Fan, and even the owner had suffered. Today someone else had come. Was it possible that the Overwatch Council was going to raid the brothel again? Could the Baoyu house continue to operate? At this time someone sighed and said, "I think the brothel will have to pay a large sum of money to settle this. It is a shame. Although the owner is a bit cruel, he is very good at business. For no reason at all, he has to feed the mouths of these officials. No matter how good the business is, it will be ruined." Bah! Someone could not bear to see him pretend to be the great priest of the Qing temple. He laughed and said, "You idiot! The owner of the Baoyu house is Mr. Fan's brother. If the Overwatch Council wanted to collect money, it would not come to us. Do you think the two of them are going to collect money from each other? There's even an old minister overseeing them." The man's face was cut and he mumbled, "Then what is this person doing here with Commissioner Fan?" It was Shi Chanli. Fan Xian was having a good time and Shi Chanli was a scholar. He had been chased to a brothel by his teacher, so it was only natural that he was in a bad mood. Si Qing'er's eyes flashed and she respectfully offered him tea. She knew that although the man in front of her was not an official, he was a trusted aide of Commissioner Fan. The owner had been missing for the past few days, and now that he had suddenly appeared, she had no idea what he was here for. She paused and then gently asked, "Mr. Shi, what brings you here today?" Shi Chanli hesitated for a moment. Si Qing'er was someone that the third prince had picked out. She didn't have much of a relationship with the Fan family, so when she saw him hesitate, she misunderstood his intentions. She covered her lips and smiled. "We are all family now. Does Mr. Shi still want to raid our building?" When she said the word raid, her tongue curled. It was a strange sound. Shi Chanli's eyebrows furrowed, and he did not like this woman's flippancy. His face darkened and he pulled out a document. In a low voice he said, "Today I am not here to raid the brothel. I am here to take over." Take over? Si Qing'er froze. She picked up the thin document from the table and quickly scanned it. Her face changed, and when she saw the red fingerprints at the bottom, she bit her lip. After a moment of silence, she finally digested the shock in her heart. She opened her eyes wide and asked, "The owner has given you all of the brothel's shares?" Her voice was filled with shock and disbelief. 70% of the Baoyu brothel's shares were worth a lot of money. How could it be so easily transferred? Si Qing'er knew that this matter was not as simple as it seemed. She frowned and said, "Mr. Shi, this is too big a deal. I cannot accept it." Shi Chanli gave a wry smile and said, "I do not need you to accept it. From today onwards I am the owner of the Baoyu brothel. I am only here to inform you." Si Qing'er gritted her teeth and said, "Mr. Shi, if I may ask, where is the owner? This is such a big deal and I have to talk to him face to face." Shi Chanli was good at writing, and the document he had drafted a few nights ago was clean and simple. He did not expect that in the end, he would be forced by Fan Xian to become the owner of the brothel. He was already uncomfortable with the situation, and he felt as if he had been caught in a trap of his own making. Hearing the question being asked, he coldly said, "Is this transfer document fake? Don't waste my time. The people who will be checking the accounts will be here soon. Don't even think about it." Si Qing'er sensed that the Fan family was preparing to leave the Baoyu brothel and use the scholar in front of her as a cover. But her rank was not high enough, and she did not know much about what was going on. Master Yuan had suddenly disappeared, and so she said, "Since the Baoyu brothel is going to be owned by Shi Chanli, I am just trying to make a living. How could I dare to argue with you?" Her heart had calmed down and she smiled and said, "But this brothel still has 30% of its shares in the hands of that young man. I'm sure you know this, Mr. Shi." No matter what was said, as long as the third prince's shares were in the Baoyu brothel, the Fan family would not be able to get rid of the Baoyu brothel. She did not know that Fan Xian had no intention of getting rid of the Baoyu brothel in the first place. Shi Chanli looked at her and suddenly laughed. His thick eyebrows twitched and he said, "Today I am closing the brothel because I would like to trouble you, Miss Qing'er. Please tell the second owner that I will be taking the 30% shares." "I will be taking them? How arrogant of you," Si Qing'er said angrily. She thought it was easy for the Fan family to give and take, but she did not expect them to take the third prince's shares. How could it be so easy? Sure Chanli had finally gotten into the role of the brothel owner, and he calmly said, "If you want to take the 30% shares, I have many ways of doing so. Bringing it up now is to give face to the second owner. Miss Chinger, you must understand this." Si Chinger coldly said, "Oh? It looks like I have to thank you, Mr. Sure. But I do not know, how much money are you willing to pay?" Sure Chanli extended a finger. 100,000? Si Chinger asked, confused. She thought this was a fair price. Even if the Baoyu brothel continued to operate well, 100,000 for 20% of the shares was a good price to pay. Sure Chanli shook his head. "Only 10,000? Si Chinger was shocked. "I only have 1,000 liang of silver," Sure Chanli said sincerely. "Scholars are always poor. You are too much." Si Chinger angrily shouted, "Do not think that the Fan family can hide the truth. Do not forget who these 30% shares belong to." Sure Chanli raised an eyebrow and calmly said, "Miss, do not misunderstand. These 70% shares belong to me, Sure Chanli. It has nothing to do with the Fan family or the Kai family. As for who the 30% shares belong to, I do not care." Si Chinger coldly said, "What if I do not give up the 30% shares? First of all, the Baoyu brothel may be found with a copy of some of their letters, such as colluding with a foreign country. As for what the charges are, I am not sure." Sure Chanli smiled and said, "Second, the Baori brothel will soon appear in the capital. Since I own 70% of the shares, I can chase away all of the workers, customers and girls. Then the Baori brothel will hire them again. Miss Chinger, think about it. The Baori brothel, which has not yet existed, can take down the Baoyu brothel in a short period of time?" Si Chinger looked determined and she refused to back down. She said, "I do not believe the first point. Would the Fan family, no Mr. Sure, be willing to see the Baoyu brothel collapse? Would they use 70% of the shares to take us down with them?" She looked proud and said, "The second point is even more impossible. When the owner chose the location, he was very particular about it. Plus, these girls have signed a death contract with us. How could they just leave?" Sure Chanli shook his head and sighed. "Miss Chinger, it looks like you still do not understand the situation. You have to understand that I am the owner of the Baoyu brothel. What death contract or living contract?" Si Chinger's face changed. Sure Chanli stood up and pushed open the window. He smiled and said, "As for the location of the Baori brothel, I will not hide it from you. It is to the side of the Baoyu brothel and it is also near Thin Lake. The reason why I came back after a few days was because 2 days ago, I was busy collecting the title deed for the land." Si Chinger was speechless. Sure Chanli was now completely immersed in his role as a ruthless businessman. He waved his hand to catch the wind from Thin Lake and continued to say, "As for taking me down with you, if you do not want to back out, then I will take you down with me. 70% of the Baoyu brothel shares may be worth a lot of money, but I do not care for it." After he said this, he laughed at himself. When did he begin to wash away his status as a scholar? Instead, he began to indulge in a life of bullying others? He was indeed threatening Si Chinger, but this kind of threat was easy to make. It seemed simple, but it was difficult for her, or rather, the third prince, to respond. The land next to the Baoyu brothel had indeed been purchased by the Overwatch Council, but no one knew what methods had been used. Sure Chanli knew that every step of taking over the brothel had been done in a very stable manner. There was no need to worry about any mistakes. Mr. Yen Bingyun was very powerful. If the third prince did not want to give up the 30% of the shares, Mr. Yen Bingyun had a way to make the Baoyu brothel close down within 10 days. "Lady, you do not know the root of this matter. Do not think too much about it." Sure Chanli did not need her to send a message to the third prince. The news that Fan Xian wanted to take over the Baoyu brothel had already been passed through the Fan manor and into the ears of Yi Pin, who was in the palace. Now the third prince was forced to copy books by Yi Pin every day. Even if he felt bad that his money had been stolen by his cousin, he could not find a way to stop this. He looked at Si Chinger's confused face, and the gentle nature of a scholar came into play. He smiled and said, "I am a very easy person to talk to. In the future, if you continue to work in the brothel and do your best, I will not mistreat you." Who knew that Si Chinger was such a stubborn person? She always wanted to be responsible for the second owner? Although the second owner was only a young child, she thought of the child's identity and thought the whole thing was ridiculous. In the capital, it was common for people to steal property, but how could someone dare to steal property from a prince? "If the second owner sends a message, I will agree." She gritted her teeth and said, "But the money in the account, you and I have to make sure to settle it properly. It cannot be messed up." Shi Chanli nodded. The group of people who had been waiting outside the brothel finally entered. Seeing the group of people, Si Qing'er's eyes widened. They were all Overwatch Council secret agents in casual clothing. They were still secret agents. With such a group of people coming to take over the brothel, who would dare to stop them? When she saw the old man with the long beard in the middle of the group, who was praising the Baoyu brothel, Si Qing'er could not help but take a deep breath. She was speechless, thinking that no matter how hard she tried, she would not be able to stop Fan Xian from taking the third prince's money. With the third Yi shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall personally taking over, no matter how the accounts were calculated, she was afraid that the Baoyu brothel would end up being owned by the Shi family. No, the goddamn Fan family. He would not choke, and perhaps he would not even bother to drink a bowl of water. Chapter 298. The shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall had always felt the pulse of the palace treasury and managed the businesses of the various kings. It had been many years since they had made an appearance. But Si Qing'er was a girl who had worked her way up from being a prostitute to being a top-notch madam. She was someone who was willing to learn, had a desire to improve, and had a deep understanding of the ways of business. She knew the old men of Qingyu Hall well. As long as they were in business, they all had a deep respect for the elders of the Yi family. It was the same as how the scholars of the world looked at Zhuang Mohan. So when Si Qing'er saw the three-leaf shopkeeper arrive, she immediately gave up all thoughts of playing tricks on the accounts. She was even more prepared to lose everything. She gracefully stepped forward and respectfully bowed. The three-leaf shopkeeper was probably in his 50s, and the beard on his chin was dyed white. He looked at Si Qing'er's beautiful face and nodded his head in appreciation. Shi Chanli was frozen to the side, wondering why Master Xian had sent such an old pervert. The three-leaf sighed and said, "This lady? You must be the owner of this building. I look at the location of the building, the lighting, and the decorations. They are all the work of a genius. I'm truly impressed. If you are willing to continue to stay in the building, I will return to Commissioner Fan. There is no need for my old bones to meddle." Si Qing'er looked embarrassed and said, "You are too kind. Everything in this building is the work of the owner. It has nothing to do with me." The third Yi shopkeeper had a look of pity on his face. He sighed and said, "This big boss is indeed a genius in business. How could he offend Fan?" Fortunately he was old and not stupid. He knew his words were going too far, so he quickly shut his mouth under the gaze of Shi Chanli, who looked at him like he was an old monster. He only shook his head vigorously and looked around. His expression was full of the sigh of someone who was at the peak of Dong Mountain but did not see any aces. In the eyes of the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, who had been involved in the business for 20 years, although the Baoyu brothel was a shady business, the building was very bright. There was a lake behind the building and there was a courtyard by the lake. The waiters knew when to stop and they knew how to be polite. The girls were not arrogant, and they did not lose their composure. It was a perfect fit for the hearts of the customers. The man who was in charge of all of this was a man who had a deep understanding of business. The old shopkeeper sighed. Shi Chanli couldn't help but shake his head, thinking that the second young master of the Fan family was not a simple son of a noble family. It was a wonderful thing though. The two brothers of the Fan family were different from the rest of the world. There had been no news from the palace, so Si Qing'er did not dare make a decision about the third prince's money. But now that the collection team had arrived, they had to bring out the account books for both parties to check. Although most businesses in the Qing kingdom had open accounts and secret accounts, in front of the three-leaf shopkeeper, Si Qing'er did not dare play any tricks. In the time it takes to burn a stick of incense, the Baoyu brothel's money had been clearly accounted for. The 30% of the shares, which had been converted into 1,000 liang of silver, had been temporarily separated. All that was left was to wait for the news from the third prince. After that, the entire Baoyu brothel would become Shi Chanli's business. After finishing all of this, Si Qing'er thought that the next owner of the Baoyu brothel would be the three-leaf shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall. She did not expect the old shopkeeper to leave in a carriage, which surprised Si Qing'er. What surprised her even more was that the new owner of the Baoyu brothel was someone she knew. Sangwon? Si Qing'er was stunned, but she quickly came to her senses. After Fan Xian had forcefully bought Sangwon away, there had been no news of her. Now she was back. Shi Chanli looked at her expression and said, "Not bad. This lady Sang will be the owner of the Baoyu brothel from now on." Si Qing'er forced herself to bow to Sangwon. Back when they were in the brothel, Sangwon was always cold and unyielding because of her reputation. It was inevitable that Si Qing'er would make things difficult for her. Now that she had become the owner of the Baoyu brothel, she knew she would not have a good time. She suppressed the anger in her chest and prepared to return to her room to pack up her belongings. Sangwon was a little uneasy. Mr. Fan had treated her well, and since he had given her the responsibility of managing the Baoyu brothel, she had to take care of it properly. But she was also a little afraid of the third prince's power. Seeing that Si Chinger was willing to back down, she felt relieved. Shi Chanli furrowed his eyebrows and said, "Lady Chinger, you cannot leave." Si Chinger coldly laughed and said, "I did not sign a contract with the Baoyu brothel. Why can't I leave?" Shi Chanli felt a headache coming on and loosened the buttons on his collar. After thinking for a while, he said, "I have never run a brothel before. Lady Sang is only a singer. If you leave, I do not know if the Baoyu brothel will be able to make money." Si Chinger now knew that he still needed her. She couldn't help but feel proud of herself. She smiled and said, "If..." Before she could finish her sentence, Shi Chanli cut her off and said, "Mr. Fan has said that if he does not say anything, you are not allowed to leave the Baoyu brothel." Si Chinger was angry. She finally understood that it was not that he needed her, but rather that he wanted her dead. She was just a woman. Even if she had some connection to the third prince, if the commissioner of the Overwatch Council had spoken, how could she say no? In this world, there was no official who would go against the Overwatch Council for the sake of a prostitute. Not even the princes would do something like that. If Mr. Fan wanted to destroy her, it would be easier than killing an ant. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, a little absent-mindedly. Shi Chanli said, "Mr. Fan? Oh no, I am going to make some small changes to the Baoyu brothel. I think Lady Chinger will be of some use in this. Perhaps in the future all the brothels in the Qing kingdom will need these changes." Si Chinger was shocked. The Baoyu brothel's business was doing well, so the big boss had already used some of his capital to open up more branches in other provinces. But as of now, the brothel business in the Qing kingdom did not have a large share. As for changes, this was how the brothel business had been run since ancient times. Unless, like the big boss, the brothel made some changes to its operations. Was Fan Xian really going to go crazy and stop all the prostitutes in the world from selling? But the problem was, if the prostitutes did not sell and if the pimps did not take in customers, would it still be a brothel? Shi Chanli did not know what she was thinking, and so he followed the instructions of his teacher and said, "First, the girls in the brothel from this day forward are to change their death contracts to living contracts. This will be for 5 years, and when the time is up they will be free to go. Second, the Baoyu brothel must have a doctor to ensure that the girls are healthy, and only then can they receive customers." Before he finished, Si Chinger was confused and asked, "Change to living contracts? What is the need for that?" Shi Chanli explained, "Sir, I was wrong again. I thought that in this line of work, 5 years is the limit. We have to give people something to think about. If they think that they can only be ridden by others for the rest of their lives, and that there is no chance of them being redeemed, the girls will be in a bad mood. Naturally, they will not be able to treat the guests well." Si Chinger mockingly said, 5 years is up. Do you think we, poor women, can stop selling? Who is going to remove their registration? The brothels of the Qing kingdom were not registered. Once a prostitute became a prostitute, she could not leave the brothel for the rest of her life, unless she was redeemed or the government had given them a special order. According to what was said before, the Baoyu brothel signed a living contract for 5 years. After 5 years, the prostitutes in the brothel would not be able to escape. Regarding this question, Shi Chanli did not answer. Master Xian had said that he would deal with it in the future. Si Chinger mockingly said, "As for the doctors, that is even more ridiculous. The girls in the brothel are of low status, and no doctor would be willing to visit them. It is difficult to even see a patient, so how could there be a doctor who would be willing to stay in the brothel? Would the men be willing to lose face like that?" Sangwon, who had been silent this entire time, smiled and said, "The commissioner said that he has many students in the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Hiring a few doctors would not be a problem." Si Chinger gave a wry smile and thought to herself that the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council was the poison department that everyone feared. Was he going to become a doctor? She increasingly felt that Fan Xian was a man who only knew how to dream. She mockingly said, "So what if there are doctors? Even if the girls are clean, who can guarantee that the guests will not suffer from venereal diseases?" Shi Chanli felt a headache coming on and said, I do not have a good idea." It was not that he did not have a good idea, it was that Fan Xian's idea of industrializing prostitution had run into the problem of not being able to popularize condoms. Listen to the last few things first. He coughed and continued to say, from now on, things like forced buying and selling cannot happen again. If something like this happens again, you will be held responsible. He stared into Si Qing'er's eyes until she lowered her head. Things like young prostitutes cannot happen again. There should be a rule for drawing water, and it should be based on the brands of the girls. The girls should have 3 days off every month and they can do whatever they want. As Big Boss Shi continued to speak, not only did Si Qing'er's face change, but even Sangwon was dazzled. Finally, Si Qing'er could not help but open her eyes wide and say, if this goes on, is the Baoyu brothel a brothel or a charity hall? Shi Chanli looked at her and said, the master has said that you are someone who was raised by Yuan Xian. Logically speaking, he should punish you. But because of your poor background, he will give you a chance to redeem yourself. You do not need to worry about whether the Baoyu brothel is a brothel or a charity hall. In any case, you should follow Lady Sang's lead and do your business. If you succeed in this endeavor, you can spread it all over the world. In the future, hundreds of thousands of girls in this brothel will be indebted to you. Consider it repaying the debt you have owed over the past few months. At this point, Shi Chanli finally brought up Fan Xian's name without hesitation. Si Qing'er was silent, and no one knew what she was thinking. Her face was full of fear. In fact, Shi Chanli's heart was full of fear. Although the Baoyu brothel would be monitored by Sangwon, who had already joined the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, he was a scholar and a student of Fan Xian. Would he never be able to become an official? Would he only be able to stay in a brothel and be the owner of a brothel? He looked at Sangwon and found that this woman, who had been a singer, was calm and steady. It did not seem as if she was troubled by this. A few days later, there was an autumn rain midway, and it was mournful and rustling, forcefully turning the clear autumn air into a cold rainy night. The Baoyu brothel had been taken over by Fan Xian, and the second prince had already sensed an ominous omen. He had begun to make arrangements. Fan Xian, on the other hand, appeared to be rather relaxed. These few days he did not go to the first bureau, nor did he go to Xingfeng restaurant to eat buns. Instead, he went to the Imperial College and with a group of young teachers, he organized the carriage of books he had brought back from northern Qi. The autumn wind blew, and the water droplets that had been hanging on the clouds for a while finally fell. They were so sparse that it was irritating. From Dambo bookstore, Fan Xian walked north for a while, and then he arrived at the gate of the Imperial College. A large area here was managed by the Imperial College and the Tungwen Pavilion. The government offices that had been set up in the first year of the Qin calendar had long been dismantled. Fan Xian raised his black umbrella and walked among the students of the Imperial College. Occasionally he would nod and greet the students who respectfully greeted him. Although his status was different from before, the emperor had not removed him from his 5th-level official position. Furthermore, he had given verbal orders for him to come to the Imperial College when he had time. Although he did not like being a teacher and had never come to class, he used his official position to come to the Imperial College to read books and hide from the wind and rain outside. He was very willing to do so. The first day he came to the Imperial College, the students could not help but be surprised. It had been almost a year since Sir Fan Jr. had come to the Imperial College. When the students thought of this young man who now held a position in the Overwatch Council, they could not help but feel a sense of conflict and fear. They were not as enthusiastic as they had been a year ago. It was not until a few hours later that they realized Sir Fan Jr. was as easy to get along with as he had been in the past that they became lively again. Arriving outside the study that the Imperial College had left for him, Fan Xian put away his umbrella and looked at the gloomy weather outside. He could not help but frown and push open the door to enter. Inside the room, a few of the Imperial College's teachers were organizing the books that Zhuang Mohan had given them. For the kingdom of Qin, the books in this carriage had a very beautiful symbolic meaning. The emperor greatly valued them, so the Imperial College did not dare to be negligent. The work of copying and maintaining the books was being carried out in an orderly manner. Seeing Sir Fan enter, the teachers hurriedly stood up and bowed. Fan Xian smiled and returned the greeting. The people in front of him were all mediocre and unaccomplished people. Because it was difficult for him to repair Zhuang Mohan's books by himself, he had forcibly taken them from the Imperial College. They had gotten along quite well over the past few days. The black cloth umbrella was placed in a corner, and water began to seep through the floor. There was a dark stove in the room, and as the two warmed, Fan Xian suddenly felt the humidity in the room increase. Feeling a little uncomfortable, he loosened his collar and said, "It's not good to be too wet. The weather is not cold yet. Sir, let us endure it for a while." How about we put out the stove? One of the teachers explained, books need a certain temperature to be stored. It's not good to be too cold. Fan Xian knew this and said, it's not winter yet. It should be fine to leave these books in the room. It's not good to be too damp either. Everyone agreed and began to bury their heads in their work. The Imperial College had inherited the style of the Kingdom of Qing's court. It paid attention to practical matters and was not easy to talk about. It was very different from Northern Qi. Fan Xian sat back down at his table, but before he had time to start working, he was asked to leave. Someone wanted to see him. Why have you returned to the Imperial College today? Fan Xian was a little surprised to see Xu Wu the scholar sitting in a chair, and he bowed respectfully. After his father-in-law, the Prime Minister, had stepped down, and the Minister of the Board of Rights had been hanged, the civil officials in the court had become a mess. Some were secretly watching Fan Xian, and some were following the Eastern Palace. Instead, it was the second prince, who had always been quiet, who, because of his many years of business and literary fame, had the most support from the civil officials. Xu Wu the scholar had once been a student of Zhuang Mohan, and had always had a great reputation. In terms of seniority, he was second to none in the court. But because he had passed the imperial examination in Northern Wei, he was now an official in the Kingdom of Qing, so there was always a problem. In the turmoil of the 5th year of the Qing calendar, he had accidentally obtained the greatest benefit. Although he had been stripped of his position as Chancellor of the Imperial College, the original scholar of the Tungwen Pavilion had been implicated in the spring examination incident and had been removed from his position. Xu Wu the scholar was extremely noble. The scholar of the Tungwen Pavilion was extremely noble. With the removal of the Prime Minister and the absence of a new Prime Minister, the scholar of the Tungwen Pavilion had to enter the palace to discuss matters. He had truly entered the center of the Qing court and was equivalent to a Prime Minister. No matter how powerful Fan Xian was in front of him, he was still just an unranked official. Of course, Xu Wu the scholar was not stupid enough to see Fan Xian as a common official. If that was the case, he would not have come to find Fan Xian today. If Commissioner Fan can calmly return to the Imperial College, why can't I? Xu Wu joked with Fan Xian, who was about the same age as his son. It's cold outside and you, a young man, know how to enjoy life and hide in the Imperial College. What? You don't want the Overwatch Council to be drenched in the rain? Cold wind and rain outside? Fan Xian did not know if Xu Wu the scholar's words had a hidden meaning. He smiled, not knowing how to respond. After Shi Chanli took over the Baoyue house, Yan Bingyun's actions began to unfold. First, he used the pressure of the Overwatch Council to force the Ministry of Justice to bypass the capital government. He directly issued an arrest warrant focusing on a few crimes and began to track down Yuan Meng. But Yuan Meng could really hide. Under the cover of King Jing's son Hong Qing, no one knew where she was hiding. Fan Xian was not in a hurry. After all, issuing the arrest warrant was to lay the groundwork for what would happen next. The later Yuan Meng was caught, the better. In Yan Bingyun's plan, everything was connected. As long as he could achieve the results he wanted, it was fine. Just 2 days ago, rumors began to spread throughout the capital. It was said that the brothel owner Yuan Meng, who the Ministry of Justice had been searching for, was actually the mistress of King Jing's son, Li Hongqing. Rumors spread easily, especially since Yuan Meng and Li Hongqing were in a relationship. So, the capital was abuzz with discussion. Li Hongqing's reputation was like a piece of juicy meat on a hot day, and it was only a matter of time before his reputation became worse. Li Hongqing and the second prince were friends, and this was something everyone knew. Not long after, another rumor began to spread. The famous Baoyue house in the capital was, in fact, the second prince. The case of the missing prostitutes being investigated by the Ministry of Justice was inextricably linked to the royal family. These rumors were very convincing. For example, Yuan Meng used to be a popular figure on Lujing River, but aside from the prince, no one had ever seen her take on any other customers. Another rumor was that on a certain day, the second prince had a long conversation with Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council outside of the Baoyue house. Although no one knew what the conversation was about, the next day the Fan family sold their shares of the Baoyue house to a mysterious businessman named Shi. These rumors were, of course, the work of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. When Fan Xian was forced to take up his post during the spring examination, he became the idol of the world's scholars. The Qing Kingdom's Wening headquarter office, when it came to creating an image, they were very good at it. When it came to pouring dirty water, they did it very well. Of course, as the rumors spread, The people of the capital learned that the original owner of the Baoyu house was actually the second master of the Fan family. The reputation of the Fan family was affected by this. But the source of the rumors was in the hands of the Fan family. They randomly tossed out a few stories about Commissioner Fan beating his brother, the old minister punishing the family, the second master breaking his leg, and the howling of evil in the garden. The Fan family selling the brothel at a loss was enough to shock the people of the capital. In addition, the Fan family no longer had anything to do with the Baoyu house, so the rumors quickly died down. When it came to controlling public opinion, Fan Xian was very familiar with it. Back then, Wu Zhu had written a few thousand leaflets, and he was able to chase the eldest princess out of the palace. Now he was dealing with the second prince, who was even more immature. Therefore, the people of the capital always believed that the second prince and Li Hongqing, who did not have any shares in the Baoyu house, were the true culprits behind the Baoyu house case. Fan Xian, on the other hand, was an innocent man. The Fan family must have had their reasons for doing so. Yan Bingyun's next step was to deal with the money between the second prince and the Chui family. Not even Fan Xian knew the specifics, but he trusted Yan Bingyun's abilities. He didn't want to get involved in this. Xu Wu, the scholar, looked at him and said with concern, "Did you know that yesterday the capital government accepted the Baoyu house case? Your second son's crime is not light. He committed murder, silenced witnesses, and forced prostitution. Today is the day he will be tried." Fan Xian gave a wry smile and said, "It is unfortunate that our family has produced such an unfilial son." Xu Wu shook his head and said, "The capital government has not yet gone to the manor to ask for him. I think they have other plans. Mr. Fan, the word, trial, is the most harmful. There is not much room for negotiation in a criminal case. If the capital government continues with the trial, the emperor will be alerted. I don't think it will end well." After this conversation, Fan Xian knew where the scholar stood. He was speaking on behalf of the civil servants in the court, and he was advising the Fan family to live in peace with the second prince. Not to mention the problem of the court's reputation, these elders believed that when two tigers fought, one would be hurt. Both Fan Xian and the second prince were the best of the Qin kingdom's younger generation. It didn't matter who lost in this fight, it would be a loss for the Qin kingdom. Of course, most people did not think Fan Xian had the right to fight a prince, even though he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian understood this, and so he knew that the scholar in front of him was trying to make peace for his sake. He couldn't help but feel touched. He smiled warmly and said, "Thank you for your advice. I believe you have already met the second prince." Xu Wu nodded. Ever since Fan Xian returned to the capital from northern Qi, he had been at odds with the second prince. The Overwatch Council had arrested many of the second prince's officials, and if he wanted to make peace, he had to first ask the second prince for his opinion. He did not expect the second prince to be so easy to talk to, and politely asked Xu Wu to speak on Fan Xian's behalf. Hearing Xu the scholar's words, Fan Xian laughed coldly in his heart. The second prince's nickname was Stone. How could he be so easy to get along with? The two sides had already shed all pretenses of cordiality, and he had been forced to send his brother to a distant foreign land. There had to be an explanation for the matter of his father-in-law being taken down by the eldest princess and the second prince, right? Furthermore, the spies of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council had already sent word that the second prince had already brought back the 3 killers of the Baoyu brothel, who had been hidden in secret. They were preparing to bring Fan Xian back to the capital's court. The second prince had asked Xu Wu to speak on his behalf to temporarily calm Fan Xian down. Fan Xian was not that stupid though. He respectfully offered tea to Xu Wu and said, "This has nothing to do with the council, and it has nothing to do with me. I have been guarding the Imperial College these past few days because I was afraid someone might misunderstand." Xu Wu could not help but smile wryly. The wrinkles on his face were full of pity and he said, "Why fight with him? Even if we win this time, so what? No matter how many times we win, it cannot compare to the happiness of the emperor." Fan Xian's heart jumped, and he knew that these words were true. He felt even more grateful to the old scholar in front of him. Although he had other thoughts in his heart, he still responded warmly, "Since you have spoken, then I have nothing else to say. As long as the capital government leaves the Fan family some face, the Ministry of Justice case will not be investigated too deeply." In the eyes of an old official like Xu Wu, Fan Xian's reply seemed a bit rash. In the officialdom, there was always a need to conceal one's dignity. How could there be such a clear and unmistakable reason to talk about such illegal matters in front of the Prime Minister? But he also knew that Fan Xian's personality was like this. He smiled in satisfaction and did not say anything. He only watched the rain outside the window of the Imperial College. 3 li from the Jingdo government office by the side of the Imperial Mountain Road, the autumn rain was falling heavily. The case of the missing prostitutes in the Baoyu brothel had already been investigated. Although the bodies had not yet been found, the capital government had already found the 3 murderers involved in the murder. If the 3 men who killed the prostitutes were arrested and brought to justice, then they would be able to claim that the second master of the Fan family was the mastermind behind the incident. This would be a huge blow to the Fan family, and it would also clear the second prince's name. So, these 3 men were important figures. The second prince's people still did not understand why the Fan family had sent these 3 men to the capital government after carrying out the family's punishment. Did this not give them something to use against them? But it was not until the Fan family sold the Baoyu brothel and began to investigate Yuan Meng and point their finger at Li Hongqing that the second prince realized that Fan Xian was using these 3 men to make him feel better. He thought he had chosen peace, and so his reaction was delayed for a few days. But the second prince still felt that Fan Xian was being unwise. As long as these 3 men were in his hands, where could the fat, pockmarked man of the Fan family run to? Now the second prince was truly angry. Fan Xian really did not know how high the sky was and how deep the earth was. He dared to make a move against the second prince. Even the ghosts knew that the rumors in the capital were spread by him. At this time, although Crown Prince Hongqing was also very depressed, he could not go to the Fan Manor to fight Fan Xian. This was because King Jing was the first to get angry. After a beating, he locked him up in the manor to avoid the storm that was brewing in the capital. Watch him carefully. Do not let anyone else have the opportunity to come in contact with him. Do not give them the opportunity to retract their statements. Fan Wuxia, one of the 8 generals of the second prince's manor, had a gloomy expression on his face. He said to the bailiffs sent by the capital government, "If you fail this mission, be careful of your own life." The bailiffs of the capital government nervously nodded. He was not nervous about this mission, but he was nervous about facing the 8 generals of the second prince. Yushan Road was only 3 miles away from the capital government. If it were not for the fact that he wanted to avoid suspicion, Fan Wuxia would have personally escorted these 3 men to the capital government's prison. The carriage began to move, and in the dark autumn rain, Fan Wuxia watched from afar. The carriage traveled in the rain as usual. There were not many people on the street, and only a few passers-by with umbrellas in their hands walked by. At this time the passers-by began to move. They flipped their umbrellas and pulled out sharp, black-stained weapons. Calmly they stabbed into the carriage. Fan Wuxia was shocked and rushed in that direction. But he was still some distance away from the carriage. Seeing the speed at which these people were moving, he knew he would not be able to save them in time. The sharp needles were as sharp as tofu. They pierced into the walls of the carriage and killed the 3 people inside. The passers-by pulled out the needles and did not make any unnecessary movements. Holding their umbrellas, they walked into the alleys on the side of the street and disappeared into the rain. Fresh blood flowed from the carriage. Fan Wuxia rushed over with a cold face. He pulled open the curtain and his face changed. The wounds all showed how professional the person who did it was. It was only a simple stab and they were already dead. Fan Wuxia could not help but take a deep breath. He began to worry for the second prince. To kill the 3 people in the carriage so cleanly was already difficult. What was even more frightening was that the other side knew exactly when they would move the witnesses. It seemed that the Overwatch Council had hidden many spies in the second prince's camp, which was why they were able to control the timing and location of the attack so well. This assassination was so perfectly planned that it looked so natural and simple. It was like eating a meal and it was not very thrilling. Only an expert like Fan Wuxia could find a soul-stirring feeling in such a plain killing situation. He did not need to think to know who had done it. Other than the assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council who always hid in the dark, who else could have done it? His face grew paler. He could not help but think if those passers-by had been trying to assassinate him, would he have been able to survive? Everyone in the second prince's camp seemed to have underestimated Fan Xian's power. That was because the new generation of people in the kingdom of Qing did not know how terrifying the Overwatch Council was. Fan Wuxia nervously rubbed the dagger in his sleeve. For the first time he felt that he should leave the second prince and save himself. My chess skills are not good. I play chess because I don't want to take the pieces, Fan Xian said with a face full of shame. He was playing chess with Xu Wu at the Imperial College. The court had ended early, and the disaster relief in the south was almost over. That was why Xu the scholar had so much free time. After only 2 rounds of chess, the old man found that Fan Xian, such an intelligent and quick-witted genius, was a complete and utter lousy chess player. He could not help but change his expression. He felt that playing this kind of chess, even if he won, would not be fun. Xu Wu sighed and said, Fan Xian, I see that you are very clever in everything you do. How is it that you are so lousy at chess? The two of them casually talked about the matters of the court. Because Minister Fan rarely talked about such things in the manner, and the Overwatch Council could not investigate their disputes in court, Fan Xian listened with great interest. He smelled some of the important matters of court that he could not touch with at his current rank. Now Yan Xiaoyi was the governor in the north and endlessly stretched out his hand for silver. The small battles in the south were also ongoing. The kingdom of Qing was currently lacking in silver. Fan Xian's heart was now at ease. As long as the emperor needed silver, the palace treasury would fall into his hands next year. The eldest princess was good at scheming, but when it came to making money from business, it was not very reassuring. The rain had stopped, and Fan Xian did not have the right to ask the old man to stay for a meal. He respectfully saw the scholar out the door, then turned around and returned to the room. He began to look through the collection of books that Master Zhuang had given him. After the teachers had left, he still had not left. He held a book in his hands, lost in thought. He knew what had happened in the capital today, but he did not take it to heart. The 3 people were already dead, but the families of the dead prostitutes had now come to the capital government to complain, pointing their fingers at the Fan family. Of course, Fan Xian would not kill them to silence them. The 3 people who had died today had been secretly hidden by the second prince. If he killed him, the second prince would not be able to report it to the emperor. Although Fan Xian was not a good person, he did not have the heart to kill the victims. In fact, he understood that if he did not care about his status as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, the resources and power he held were far greater than the second prince's. If there were no accidents in this battle, of course he would win. But the world did not know this. The only thing that Fan Xian cared about was the attitude of the emperor in the palace. If the emperor felt that these little bastards playing around was nothing, then Fan Xian could continue to play. He actually had a good grasp of the emperor's thoughts. The second prince was just a whetstone. Although he was used to sharpen the crown prince, he was also used to sharpen the future Overwatch Council Director Fan Jr. Looking at Director Fan Jr.'s methods and thoughts, it seemed like a good choice. Of course, if Fan Xian really did go too far, the palace would only need to issue an edict to settle the matter. He was not worried that the emperor would hurt him because of this matter. On the contrary, he would laugh at himself and think, everyone is a bastard. You, the emperor, can't kiss one egg and kiss another. The rain in Jingdo stopped. He quietly avoided everyone's gaze and left the Imperial College. In a clothing store, he took off his outer garment, revealing the pure work clothes underneath. He then took a normal outer garment from the hands of the lowly shopkeeper and put it on. Only then did he flip over his rain hat to hide his face and disappear into the streets of Jingdo. The rain had already stopped. The leaden clouds in the sky seemed to have been melted by the sun. They gradually thinned and flattened, then gradually split apart. Following the arc of the sky, they flowed toward the 4 corners of the sky, revealing a large piece of blue sky in the center and the particularly fresh autumn day after their victory. The sun shone on the outside of the yamen of the capital government. A few rays of light penetrated into the hall, clearly illuminating the just and honorable sign in the hall. There was already a crowd gathered outside the capital government, waiting for the prefectural magistrate to personally investigate the Baoyue brothel case, which had recently caused a stir. This case had a background, a murder, and involved a prostitute that made people's imaginations run wild. It happened in a place of pleasure, and it satisfied many of the aesthetic requirements of the people of Jingdo. Thus, it was the focus of everyone's attention. If one did not know much about this case, it would be embarrassing to speak up. If the carriage drivers did not know the whole story of this case, they would not have the face to drive a carriage for a customer. Fan Xian disguised himself as a passerby and blended into the crowd. He looked into the yamen and couldn't help but feel a strange feeling in his heart. The capital government was the most important yamen, and the changes in personnel in the last 2 years could not escape his involvement. He was afraid that once this matter was over, the Jingdo prefectural magistrate would have to apologize and resign. Chapter 299. The previous prefect of the capital, Mei Zhili, was a student of Lady Lu's father. He had always supported the Fan Manor, and during the Guobaoquan Black Fist case he had helped Fan Xian a great deal. After Fan Xian was assassinated on Yolan Street, Mei Zhili, as the prefect of the capital, was punished as well. His salary was forfeited for a year and he was put on probation. But no one could have predicted that the next year, there would be another assassination attempt. After much trouble, Mei Zhili was removed from his position and sent to another county. The Fan Manor and Mei Zhili still kept in touch with each other, so Fan Xian knew that Mei Zhili was very happy to leave the capital government. In the hall there was a large row of people who looked very poor. They were kneeling in front of the table and crying. These people were the relatives of the prostitutes who had died in the Baoyu brothel. As they cried, they cursed the Fan family and they begged for justice. The current prefect of the capital government, Tian Jingmu, looked very righteous. His lips twitched and his eyes were wet. It seemed as if he had been moved by the words of the victims. He immediately ordered the servants of the government to go to the Baoyu brothel and arrest the suspects. They investigated the crime scene, and he solemnly expressed his desire to do justice for the people. He ordered people to go to the Fan Manor and ask for the second master of the Fan family, who had committed all sorts of crimes. He did not mention the names of Yuan Meng and the others. Fan Xian watched coldly from within the crowd. He could see the slight panic in the magistrate Tian Jingmu's eyes. He knew that the magistrate knew that the 3 thugs involved in the murder of the prostitutes were already dead. Fan Xian did not react to the cries of the victims in the hall. After all, the Baoyu brothel was responsible for the deaths of the prostitutes. He and his brother were only cursed at, and that was nothing. He was just wondering if these victims were real, or if they had been arranged by the second prince. The results of the Overwatch Council's investigation had not yet been released, but he had to do something about it. The trials of the Jingdo government were very tedious. This kind of show had been performed many times over the past thousands of years. Although the commoners who were watching the excitement still enjoyed it, Fan Xian's mind had already turned elsewhere. The reason why he came here today was because he reckoned that something was about to happen. His father-in-law, the treacherous Prime Minister Lin Ruofu, was forced to step down in dejection. Although the root cause was his sudden appearance and the emperor's heart, the actual fuse was Wu Bowen, who had died under the grape trellis. Because Peng Tingxing of Shandong Road had incited the Wu family and killed Wu Bowen's son, Wu Bowen's widow had come to the capital to complain. On the way, she had been intercepted by the people of the Prime Minister's manor, but had been saved by the second prince and Li Hongqing. Would the second prince do the same today? Fan Xian did not hold a grudge against his father-in-law, but he remembered the second prince's methods. Logically speaking, a true expert at scheming would never repeat his methods. However, he had seen through the second prince. Although the second prince liked to squat on the chair and put on an unfathomable expression, after so many days of probing, he had finally revealed the immaturity and stubbornness of a young man. Aside from the terrifying power of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian had an advantage over the second prince. Although he was younger than the second prince in this life, in reality he had much more experience. Not long after, the capital government's bailiffs had brought back the owner of the Baoyu brothel, Si Qing'er. There were also people who were looking for clues in the lake behind the Baoyu brothel. But there were no direct witnesses, so they did not know where the bodies were buried. Fan Xian looked at the woman kneeling on the stone floor and wondered how she would deal with the situation. Would she be intimidated by the pressure and be more obedient, or would she still be unwilling to give up? As for the bodies that were buried in the Baoyu brothel, the Overwatch Council had already worked with Shi Chanli to retrieve them one night and bury them in the suburbs of the capital. They were waiting for the case to be concluded, and then they would find a way to notify their real families. Si Qing'er, who was in the hall, bit her lips. Although she did not say anything, it was only when the old man above her asked her a question that she answered. Her heart was clear as a mirror. Before she came, Mr. Shi had already told her what she could say and what she could not. Fortunately, the owner of the house was not too strict. He did not ask her to do anything dirty, and he did not ask her to cover up for the second master of the Fan family. She only told him what she wanted. So, before the capital government's magistrate could begin his sentence, she told him the name of the owner of the Baoyu brothel and what he had done. But when it came to the murder of the prostitutes, she was adamant that it was Yuan Meng who was wanted by the Ministry of Justice. Although the owner knew about it, he did not participate in it. The capital government's magistrate was pleased with how smoothly the kneeling woman had answered. But the more he listened, the more it seemed as if she was trying to clear the name of the second master of the Fan family. And the second prince had already told him that this matter could not be related to Yuan Meng. His face darkened and he threw the stick in front of him and shouted, "This woman is very cunning. Beat her." The capital government's bailiffs picked up sticks and began to torture Si Chinger. Si Chinger gritted her teeth and endured the pain. She knew that the Fan family was watching. She no longer had the support of the third prince, and if she wanted to rely on the Fan family to survive in the capital, then she would have to go down the dark path. She endured the pain and did not speak, but it was not as if she could not scream. She cried out in pain, and there was a hidden bitterness in her voice. She floated around the capital government's yamen, and it made the people who were watching feel sorry for her. Fan Xian watched this from the outside, and he was surprised by the woman's cruelty. After the torture, Si Chinger continued to say the same thing she had said before. The capital government's magistrate was about to begin another round of torture when the officials who had gone to the Fan Manor to arrest Fan Xija came back, covered in dust and looking defeated. This group of people had gone to the Fan Manor to arrest Fan Xija, and they had used the capital government's sign to force their way in. But at this time Fan Xija had probably already reached Songzhou, and he was hugging Lady Yenner in his carriage, sighing about how difficult it was to leave his homeland. The bailiffs were about to ask a few more questions, but Lady Lu led a group of servants and beat them out with brooms. Hearing his subordinates being humiliated, the capital government's magistrate was not angry at all. Instead, he was secretly happy and he shouted, "How dare these nobles be so presumptuous? How dare they harbor a criminal?" He made up his mind. Tomorrow he would report this matter to the Fan Manor and see how they would answer for it. Fan Xian looked on coldly, but he was not in a hurry. With Lady Lu at home, he knew what his aunt was capable of. How could he have handled this matter without thinking it through? Furthermore, Mr. Yan Binghe was very trustworthy when it came to scheming. Back in the day, he had the entire northern Qi kingdom in the palm of his hand, so there was no way he would be able to handle a criminal case like this. As expected, the crowd outside the manor parted and a few people walked in. The one leading them was Fan Xian's partner on his first visit to the capital government. It was Mr. Zheng, an official of the Fan Manor, and a famous scribe of the capital government. Mr. Zheng was famous and so he did not need to kneel. He simply bowed to the magistrate and said, "Sir, what you say is absurd. Everyone in the capital knows that the Fan Manor has always been strict and fair. There is no such thing as harboring a criminal. As for what the second young master has done, you will have to investigate it in detail. The Fan Manor will not be biased." The magistrate of the capital government, Tian Jingmu, knew that the official in front of him was a famous scribe in the capital, and the lawyer next to him, Song Shuren, was even more famous for being a troublesome litigator. For the Fan family to put on such a show, they must be prepared to go the open route. His face darkened and he shouted, "If you are not biased, then why don't you bring the criminal in?" In the cold autumn weather, Song Shuren waved his fan and laughed. Capturing criminals is the business of the capital government. Since when did it become someone else's business? Tian Jingmu laughed coldly. Your second young master has committed a crime, so of course he must hand over the criminal. If he does not hand over the criminal, then is that not harboring a criminal? It is written clearly in the law of the Qin kingdom. Song Shuren, you should shut up. Song Shuren did not listen and laughed. The law of the Qin kingdom states clearly that the criminal must first hand over the criminal. But sir, the second young master of the Fan family disappeared 8 days ago. Where are we supposed to find him? Tian Jingmu was so angry that he laughed. Ha! Oh, what a ridiculous excuse. Song Shuren looked distressed. Let the magistrate know that this is not an excuse. A few days ago, the Fan family reported to the capital government that the second young master had done many illegal things, but you did not pay any attention to them. At the time, they also said that the second young master had fled to escape punishment, and asked the capital government to quickly send bailiffs to arrest him. He waved his paper fan again and said in a pained voice, Minister Fan and Sir Fan Jr. would not hesitate to put justice before family. How could they be harboring a criminal? Tian Jingmu slammed his gavel and couldn't help but curse. When did the Fan family report to us? And when did they report Fan Xija missing? How come I didn't know about this? Don't even think about muddying the waters and getting out of this mess. Whether or not there was, please look into the case file and you will know. Song Shuren put on a fake smile and cupped his hands in salute. Tian Jingmu's heart froze and he immediately came to his senses. He did not call for the bailiffs to examine the case file on the spot. Instead, he found an excuse to leave the court. He and the advisor went to the study and carefully looked over the case file from the past few days. When he saw the case file, which clearly stated that the second young master of the Fan family had fled to escape punishment, the capital magistrate almost fainted from anger. There was no such thing, so how could there be such a file? The capital government was heavily guarded. Even if the Overwatch Council were to make a move, it would be difficult not to alert anyone. How could the Fan family have such power? To be able to play such a trick without anyone knowing? Tian Jingmu's face was extremely ugly. He knew that there was a traitor in the capital government, but he could not immediately tell whether it was the magistrate or the official registrar who had done this. When Tian Jingmu returned to the court, he was no longer as stubborn as he had been at the beginning. After all, the case file was here, and during the examination both the magistrate and the official registrar were beside him. Even if he was willing to risk destroying the Fan family's case file, there was no way he could hide it. This way, even if Fan Xizha was found guilty, the Fan family had already made the first contribution. The Fan family's second young master had fled to escape punishment, and the Fan family did not purposely hide it. If this continued, how could the Fan family be dragged into this mess? In the end, the emperor would charge the Fan family with lax governance, and cut their titles and salaries. It would be impossible to achieve the results that the second prince had requested. The capital magistrate had a headache, but he was not willing to give up. With a dark face, he continued to fight with the Fan family's large team of litigation masters. The capital government temporarily retreated from the court. Fan Xian knew that they had done enough on the surface. From now on, Fan Xizha would become someone who fled to escape punishment. When Fan Xian was truly in power, he would find a way to clear his name, and the Fan family would finally be able to escape. As for the owner of the Baoyu house, Shi Chanli, because he had taken over after the incident, no matter how unreasonable the capital government was, they would not be able to bring him to justice. Fan Xian could not help but laugh. He even talked about the case with a man who was standing next to him. The families of the victims were being led by the bailiffs to a place behind the government to rest. His lips curled up and he said goodbye to the man and followed them. His eyes glanced at the corner of the street, and under the eaves, there was a man who looked like a scholar. The families of the prostitutes were making their way to the corner of the street, and just as they were about to disappear from the sight of the onlookers, 4 or 5 masked men came out of nowhere. In their hands were shining knives, and these masked assassins danced wildly. Their attacks were ruthless, and they cut down on the bodies of the victims. The streets were filled with cries and wails. The people who were watching the show also shouted and fled in all directions. Fan Xian stood under a large locust tree and squinted as he watched the scene unfold. He was not worried, and in fact he underestimated the power of the second prince. They were using the same tactic and their actions were very clumsy. Last time they succeeded in framing the prime minister because the emperor wanted them dead. The emperor did not want to kill them all, and now they were doing the same thing on the street. Were they not afraid that the emperor would laugh at them for being so simplistic? As for the lives of the victims, Fan Xian was not worried about them. Sure enough, a group of passers-by appeared out of nowhere at the end of the street and directly mixed into the battle. They quickly hid the victims of the murder behind them and faced the killers. Passers-by again, Fan Xian's favorite passers-by. The passers-by were not wielding knives, but were instead wielding spikes specially prepared by the Overwatch Council. With a few moves they broke through the blades of the assassins and closed in. Their attacks were clean and efficient, and their style was simple and powerful. They seemed to have traces of Sir Wuxia. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. He knew that this was because the true leader of the 6th Bureau, the Shadow, was Wu Zhu's admirer. The assassins sent by the second prince were actually quite skilled, but compared to the people of the 6th Bureau, their attacks were somewhat redundant. After a short fight they were utterly defeated. These people instinctively wanted to escape, but the passers-by were like maggots on bones. There was nothing they could do. Clang, clang. This sudden ambush and counter-ambush came to an abrupt end. The masked assassins fell miserably on the street, their bodies covered with a few miserable wounds, blood flowing everywhere. Fan Xian looked over and nodded. He was very satisfied with Yan Xiaoyan's arrangements. It did not matter if they were left alive, but they could not let these people escape under the watchful eyes of the public. Presumably, these assassins had the Overwatch Council's secret mark on them, so that they could frame Fan Xian. The result of this ambush was also within his expectations. The assassins raised by the princes could only be considered part-time assassins. When faced with the professionals of the 6th Bureau, they would naturally lose miserably. At this moment something strange happened. In the corner of the street, the scholar who was hiding from the rain under the eaves suddenly floated out and entered the fray. He drew his sword, and with a free will, the light of the sword carried a pure jinqi. The jinqi on the sword was pure and violent, and it caused the puddles on the street to rise into the air. It transformed into a water arrow and went straight for one of the victims. What a powerful sword aura. It came from the hands of such a weak scholar. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau, who were disguised as passers-by, could not react in time. They did not dare to fight against the white mist that mixed with the rain sword. They dodged to the side, and the sharp needles shot out from their elbows in an attempt to slow down the skilled swordsman's sword. With several chi-chi sounds, the spike only pierced through the lower hem of the scholar's robe and brought down a few strands of cloth. It was completely unable to block the might of his sword. With a piu sound, the unadorned sword had already pierced into the body of one of the victims. Xia Bian, the most arrogant of the 8 generals of the second prince. He once said that he could defeat Fan Xian with one strike of the sword. He was the Xia Bian who killed Fan Xian. Fan Xian recognized the scholar who was hiding from the rain under the eaves at first glance. But he did not expect that, with his status and power, he would be so shameless as to attack the victim's family. Everything was set in stone. Even if Xia Bian killed the victim's family, so what? Fan Xian thought Xia Bian was only here to monitor the situation. He did not expect Xia Bian to throw away his pride and attack. So, his reaction was a little slow. The moment Xia Bian drew his sword, he knew that since the 6th Bureau was there, his plan to frame him had failed. Although he was arrogant, he didn't have the confidence that he could kill all the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau in broad daylight on the streets of Jingdo. They lived in the shadows all year round. However, he still had to draw his sword because he couldn't accept it. He watched helplessly as his subordinates were stabbed by those passers-by, while the victims he wanted to kill, although terrified, were unharmed. This kind of complete failure made him angry, so he chose to draw his sword irrationally and violently. Killing the victim's family was a good thing. At least it could save the second prince some face in his fight against Fan Xian. Plus, if even one of these prostitutes' family died, Fan Xian would have to spend a lot of time and energy explaining what had happened. His right hand, which was holding the hilt of his sword, felt a familiar vibration. He knew that the tip of his sword had once again pierced into a stranger's body. He was going to take away another innocent soul. He was satisfied and he laughed arrogantly. He pulled his sword back and watched the victim's chest bleed. And then, his smile immediately froze. Xia Bian was confident that his sword would not miss, and it did indeed pierce into the victim's body. The only strange thing was that the tip of the sword was a few inches away from the middle of the body. It was this distance that prevented his sword from killing the victim. And he had already lost his second chance to draw his sword. The victim in front of him was like a kite. He was miserably slanted, but he quickly flew to the right. He did not know what kind of power could pull a person in a direction that defied the laws of physics. Xia Bian unconsciously twisted his wrist and brought his sword up in front of his chest. He suddenly turned his head, but he only had time to see Fan Xian, who had just rushed over, retract his foot. Fan Xian. As a brilliant swordsman, he immediately sensed his opponent's aura. Amidst his sharp cry, he gathered all the power in his sword and pierced straight and unstoppable toward Fan Xian's face. At that moment, the passers-by of the 6th Bureau knew that Fan Xian had arrived. They protected the victim, who was still in shock, and retreated to a safe place. Fan Xian's kick had saved the victim's life, and he had no time to pull out his dagger. He looked at the cold light coming towards him and he felt the cold air of the sword. He felt as if his eyelashes were going to fall off. Xia Bian raised his hand. Chi, 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 3 consecutive sounds rang out. 3 crossbow bolts were dipped in anti-airus poison. They flew against the wind of the sword and quickly flew towards Xia Bian's face. The tip of the sword was pointed at Xia Bian's face, and the crossbow bolts were also aimed at his face. The two of them clearly had no interest in competing in the thickest of skin. Fan Xian was silent and he coldly twisted his body. He used his strong control of his body, and the cold sword brushed past his face. He punched Xia Bian's chest. The punch was full of jinchi and it broke through the air like thunder. If it hit, Xia Bian's organs would be crushed. Xia Bian waved his left sleeve as if his life depended on it. A cloud appeared and it brushed away the 2 small crossbows. He wanted to take Fan Xian's life with his sword, but he didn't expect Fan Xian to take such a risk and throw out his terrifying fist. He screamed and cut his wrist. His left hand turned into a palm and he slapped Fan Xian's fist. There was a crisp crack and Xia Bian's wrist was broken. Fan Xian. Xia Bian shouted angrily. It wasn't because he was afraid of Fan Xian's jinchi, but because when the fist and the palm collided, a faint yellow smoke exploded from between the two. Xia Bian didn't expect Fan Xian to use such a despicable method, even when he had the upper hand. At this moment, the poisonous smoke had entered his body, and his sword power had been exhausted. He was powerless to cut horizontally, and he was in a rush to meet Fan Xian's strange and tyrannical fist. He was wide open, and the last of the 3 arrows pierced into his shoulder. He was poisoned again. Fan Xian. Xia Bai, and cursed Fan Xian's name for the 3rd time. He knew he had underestimated Fan Xian's power. He forced the Jinqi in his body to swing his sword to the west, aiming for Fan Xian's throat. It was a vicious attack. Xia Bai's body floated up into the air, ready to jump onto the roof of a house. He wanted to escape from this powerful yet treacherous master. But how could Fan Xian let him escape? A gray shadow flashed by and Fan Xian was already in midair. He had Xia Bai's body entangled. He extended his right arm and chopped down on Xia Bai's ankle. This palm knife was a small trick of the coffin breaker. Although it was attacking a corner that Xia Bai didn't care about, it still did a lot of damage. Xia Bai grunted. He felt as if his ankle had been crushed. An unbearable pain spread through half of his body, and it slowed his speed of escape. In that moment, Fan Xian silently made his move. He didn't know how many times he had attacked Xia Bai. The 2 of them stood on the drizzling street again. They became 2 blurry shadows. One was gray and the other was black. They tangled together. There was a series of muffled sounds. Xia Bai's body was hit countless times by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had attacked too quickly, and so his Jinqi hadn't been used. Xia Bai had used his decades of training to withstand the blows, but the tip of Fan Xian's sword was like the wind. It couldn't even touch Fan Xian's body. This reality made Xia Bai feel hopeless. How could Fan Xian be so fast? Xia Bai screamed. He shook his wrist, and his sword became a silver rain to protect his body. Finally, Fan Xian was forced to take a few steps back. There was a thud. Xia Bai's trembling right hand was propped up against the ground. The tip of the sword was stabbed into the puddles of water. It trembled, and a few strange lines appeared on the surface of the water. Looking at Fan Xian, who looked calm, Xia Bai felt pain in his body. It was as if there were countless knives cutting through his veins. He knew that Fan Xian's attacks had damaged his internal organs, and the poison in his body was starting to take effect. His right leg was about to lose its balance. Facing his opponent, who looked calm, Xia Bai had lost the confidence to fight. 9. Xia Bai knew that even if he didn't underestimate Fan Xian, he was no match for Fan Xian. He now had a completely different opinion of Fan Xian's power. He thought about it, and after saying the word 9, the wounds in his body flared up again. He coughed up a few streaks of blood and swallowed the last word. He looked at Fan Xian and his eyes flashed with confusion. He still remembered when he was in the tea shop outside of the Baoyue brothel. He had boasted that he, by himself, could defeat Fan Xian. That was built on his confidence in himself and his judgment of Fan Xian. Although this young man, whose surname was Fan, had killed Qing Jushu on Yolan Street last year, Xia Bai did not believe that the son of an influential family could have the willpower to truly devote himself to the path of martial arts. He did not believe that he could possess such exquisite and practical killing skills. But who would have thought that such a rich young man had already entered the 9th level? 9th level. Xia Bai coughed, but he still managed to squeeze out those 2 words. His right thumb moved slightly and he pressed it against the hilt of his sword. Fan Xian's feet touched the ground, and his entire body shot towards Xia Bai like an arrow. A black light flashed and he used his best dagger to cut through the sword Xia Bai had used to kill himself. At the same time he mercilessly punched Xia Bai's temple. Then like a wisp of smoke he retreated. It was as if he had never attacked. Xia Bai fainted on the street in the dirty rainwater. His body was covered in wounds and the water splashed everywhere. Fan Xian would not give a loser a chance to express his feelings or pose for a moment before he died. Finally, the bailiffs of the capital government arrived. The capital government magistrate heard the news, and he pretended to be surprised. Seeing the situation, his heart froze. He knew that the second prince's plan had been foiled. Looking at Fan Xian, who was smiling, Tian Jingmu did not know what to feel. Someone wanted to kill me. I happened to come to the capital government to listen to my brother's case, and I happened to run into them. Fan Xian's face was calm as he spoke, but his right hand was still trembling. Fortunately, I had a few capable subordinates with me. Otherwise, these people would not have succeeded. Xia Bai, who had acted on his own, had not succeeded in killing himself. For Fan Xian, being able to obtain one of the 8 generals was a pleasant surprise. The 8 generals of the second prince's manor were not a secret in the capital. Today so many people saw Xia Bian assassinate the victim of the murder case. It was a great opportunity for the 8th Bureau to spread rumors. Fan Xian wanted to say thank you to Xia Bian, who was lying on the ground. The capital government bailiffs took over the watch, and there was nothing else for Fan Xian to do. He did not need to reveal Xia Bian's identity, as his subordinates would take care of it. I will hand this man over to you, sir. Fan Xian looked at the capital government magistrate with a smile that was not a smile. This man is evil. Please watch him carefully, sir. Fan Xian had no intention of taking Xia Bian back to the Overwatch Council. Even if he found out that the murder of the victim was ordered by the second prince, if it was the Overwatch Council that found out, it would be much weaker. He handed the unconscious Xia Bian over to the capital government. He had a dark plan in mind as well. Xia Bian was handed over alive. If he died in the future, things would become very interesting. The capital government magistrate was a third-rank official, and the Overwatch Council could not investigate him without permission. It was a rare opportunity for Fan Xian to kill him. How could Fan Xian miss it? If he missed it, even Yan Bingyun would scold him for being soft-hearted. In the capital, people had not yet recovered from the shock of what happened. Without a doubt, what happened outside the capital government would become a topic of conversation. In the eyes of the nobles who knew what was going on, the battle between the second prince and Fan Xian was tipping the scales of victory in favor of the second prince. That is, if the emperor did not object and the palace remained silent. His subordinates, who were disguised as passers-by, guarded Fan Xian as they walked into the manor. One of them saw Fan Xian's trembling right hand, and thought he had been injured in the fight. Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's nothing. I'm just a little excited. It's been a few months since I've enjoyed something like this." This was the truth. The fight with Xia Bian had made Fan Xian excited. He seemed to enjoy this sort of work. Sometimes he even thought that perhaps Yan Bingyun was more suited to be the head of the Overwatch Council, and that he was more suited to work for Yan Bingyun. However, the trembling of his right hand was not only due to excitement. Fan Xian gently rubbed his wrist. His originally sunny mood suddenly had an additional trace of haze. Chapter 300. During this period of time, the Overwatch Council, under the guidance of Commissioner Fan and Yan Bingyun Jr., had armed themselves to the teeth. They did not hesitate to tear into the second prince's faction, from officials to economic interests. With the Baoyu brothel incident as the catalyst, and with the assassination attempt outside the capital government as the root cause, they attacked the royal court and the Dasua Trading Company. They dug into the deepest recesses of the other party's soul, and with a flash of crafty thought, they pressed forward. First of all, it was no surprise that one of the 8 generals, Xia Bian, had suddenly died in the capital's prison. This gave the Overwatch Council a good excuse. The Overwatch Council sent 3 memorials to the palace, and finally Tian Jingmu was suspended from his duties for further investigation. The stupid move that the second prince had made in order to protect himself had caused the council to link up with one another and directly remove the second prince's greatest support in the capital. On the other hand, Yan Bingyun had begun to use other methods to successfully control the supply routes from Xinjiang to the capital. He had forced the Cui family into a state of panic, and no one knew how much money they had lost. They had no choice but to use the funds of the Jiangnan family in order to forcefully reopen the route to the north, which had been cut off by Xinjiang's death. The second prince's money began to shrink. The public opinion was not in favor of the second prince's faction. Although there were experts in the palace, they were not as effective and professional as the Overwatch Council. Compared to the propagandists of the 8th Bureau, the workers sent by the palace to the tea-houses and taverns did not have the power to sway the hearts of the people. Although the Overwatch Council was ruthless, the people of the capital were still on the side of the Fan family. They felt that the missing second master of the Fan family had become a scapegoat for the second prince, which was why Fan Xian Jr. was so ruthless. As for Hongqing, poor Crown Prince Jing, his reputation was even worse. Who told him to have an affair with Yuan Meng? Everyone in the capital knew that next spring, Li Hongqing was going to marry the eldest daughter of the Fan family. But you ordered Fan Xizha, who was only 14 years old, to open a brothel, and made him take the blame for the murder of a prostitute. Mother **her, how could there be a brother-in-law in this world who would use his brother-in-law so shamelessly? For a period of time, the second prince's faction was beaten back step by step, be it in the officialdom or in other aspects. Their morale was low and they had no strength to fight back. The only counterattack they attempted was the imperial censorate, which was under the control of the eldest princess. But the imperial censorate wasted their efforts. All of the actions of the Overwatch Council were carried out according to the laws of the Qing Kingdom, and there was not a single place where they could be used against them. As for the assassination of the 3 witnesses of the Baoyue brothel murder case, it was a headless murder case. Even if someone guessed that it was the Overwatch Council who did it, there was no evidence. The Overwatch Council's attitude toward the assassination was simple and clear. The 3 men had been personally sent by Commissioner Fan's family to the yamen of the capital government. How could they have died outside the capital government? If there was a problem, the biggest problem would be Tian Jingmu, who was on good terms with the second prince. Fan Xian was very satisfied with the results of the battle so far. In any case, the bottom line of the palace was there, and he could not directly chase the second prince out of the capital. As long as he could weaken the second prince to the point where he could no longer threaten him, beat him until he was in unspeakable pain, and vent the anger of the Fan family, that was enough. Up until now, the terrifying power of the Overwatch Council had only been revealed to the public. The reason why this operation was able to go so smoothly was because Qin Pingping had used the transfer order to give all of the authority to Fan Xian. More importantly, Fan Xian's operation had been planned since he was in Shangjing, northern Qi. From summer to autumn, he and Yin Bingyun had been preparing for this for a long time. At the time, the memorials that were presented to the imperial censorate had mentioned the relationship between the second prince and the eldest princess. But last time the emperor had not released it. This time, because of the Baoyue brothel incident, Fan Xian had used his anger to bring this matter forward. If the Overwatch Council still could not win this battle, Qin Pingping would probably jump out of his wheelchair in anger and yell at these little bastards for ruining the reputation of the Overwatch Council. The palace remained eerily quiet. All the nobles, including the second prince's mother, imperial concubine Shu, the crown prince of the Eastern Palace, and the empress, seemed to be deaf and blind. They were cautious and did not express any opinions. Everyone knew that this was to see the emperor's attitude. What was the emperor doing? News had come out of the palace. The emperor had invited Jiangnan's Daoist troupe into the palace to perform in a play. At this time there was a storm in Jingdo, but the emperor of the Qing kingdom still had spare time to accompany the empress dowager and watch a play for a day. Who knew how many baskets of copper coins he had given out? He was indescribably happy and relaxed. Now everyone finally saw the situation clearly. It seemed that the emperor did not think this kind of small matter was worth watching. He did not even bother to lift his eyelids. How could the small fights of young people in the capital compare to the plays performed by famous troops in Jiangnan? The situation was now clear. The court officials who had maintained a neutral stance, used their sharp minds and suddenly discovered a reality. Fan Xian's emperor's favor had reached a shocking level. Who was Fan Xian's opponent? It was the second prince, the emperor's own son. His Majesty could actually be so impartial. What kind of favor was this? These people did not dare to offend the second prince, so they could only stand even more firmly on the wall. They stuck their feet in the mud and stubbornly practiced the grassroots spirit. They swayed left and right, but they were not willing to casually lean to any side. This reality made the second prince suck in a breath of cold air. He knew that these years he had quietly developed his power in the court. He could not help but think, could it be that after Fan Xian returned to the capital, Fan Xian had secretly received instructions from the palace to target him? However, the second prince was also a sinister person. He knew that the current situation did not allow him to retreat. Even if he was willing to put aside his pride as a prince and hope to shake hands with Fan Xian a second time, Fan Xian might not be in the mood to do so. Furthermore, the emperor's warm attitude made the second prince know that if he could not defeat Fan Xian, then he could only wait for Fan Xian to knock him down to the ground, just as they had said in the tea shop. Under this strong pressure, the second prince once again reluctantly made his move. The imperial censorate once again impeached Fan Xian. This time the charges were very real and the evidence was very solid. In short, it had nothing to do with what Fan Xizha had done, and it also involved the Minister of Revenue Fan Jian. The snow-like memorials were sent to the provinces, completely skipping over the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court. They directly asked the Fan father and son to step down and apologize. It was a battle to the death. On this day, dozens of remonstrants put on an even grander display than the last time they had impeached Fan Xian. They knelt straight in front of the palace gate. There was no rain today, and on the greenish-gray square in front of the palace, dozens of red official robes fluttering in the autumn wind were particularly eye-catching. The court elders who came and went from the palace gate could not help but shake their heads and hide behind a corner door, not daring to interfere. According to the laws of the Qing kingdom, officials who were impeached were required to explain themselves. For this impeachment, the Fan father and son had to personally go to the palace to apologize to the emperor, and then explain themselves in court. But in court, the second prince's faction was still very powerful, and the debate in front of the palace was not easy for the Fan father and son to pass. The censors of the imperial censorate were full of confidence. They were waiting for Fan Jian and Fan Xian, two of the most corrupt officials in the Qing kingdom, to be taken down by them. This time was different from last time. This time, with the help of the second prince, they were able to obtain concrete evidence. It was enough to prove that the Fan family and even the Liu family's Zhongyi manor were connected to the infamous Baoyu brothel. They knelt on the ground and excitedly waited for Fan Xian's arrival. Even if the Fan family had sent Fan Xizhi away and gotten rid of the Baoyu brothel, and even if the emperor had shown mercy, the evidence was still there. The Fan family would have to pay the price. They were waiting for the arrogant commissioner of the Overwatch Council to appear in front of them and admit his mistakes, apologize and bow his head. It was not just the imperial censораte's censors. Many people were prepared to see how the Fan Manor or the Overwatch Council would react in the face of such an aggressive impeachment. Every official wanted to keep their face, and to be bitten by the imperial censorate like this was a very embarrassing thing to do. Everyone knew that Fan Xian was a person who placed great importance on his reputation, so the officials were even more interested. Even Xu Wu the scholar was waiting to see Fan Xian's wretched appearance with a heart full of mischief, revenge, or ridicule. But no one expected that when the emperor summoned Fan Xian, he would not come. Not only did he not come, but Minister Fan did not come either. This pair of father and son had a tacit understanding, and shamelessly used the same trick: escape while sick. Hearing this news, the second prince was shocked. He did not expect the Fan family to not only be like a hungry wolf when it came to profit, but when it came to the issue of face, they were also ruthless. They did not even give the second prince a chance to win back some face. Ruthless, this father and son were ruthless. Xu Wu, the scholar, was old and used to hiding in the meeting room outside the corner door and drinking tea. After hearing this news, he spat out a mouthful of tea. He had gone to the Imperial College to play a few games of chess with Fan Xian. Fan Xian had promised to play, but now he had caused such a commotion in the capital. He even said he did not want to eat the pieces. Xu Wu the scholar was so angry at Fan Xian, who was outwardly respectful but had a belly full of evil tricks. He had hoped to see Fan Xian suffer a setback at the court conference, but he did not expect the kid to say he was sick and not come. This made the old scholar, who had been watching a show, unable to vent his anger. He was very unhappy. The news of the Fan father and son claiming illness reached the palace. The emperor, who was reading the memorials from the counties, was also shocked. He furrowed his brows and did not say anything. The concubines in the rear palace also knew of this matter. They laughed and scolded that this child of the Fan family was a troublemaker. He did not know how to make the emperor less annoyed. They also did not know how Yi Chen had married such a husband. At first he had seemed full of poetry. Now he was a disgruntled scoundrel. The ones who were most disappointed were the imperial censorate kneeling outside the palace gate. Since the other party claimed illness and did not come, no matter how murderous they were, there was no point of resistance. Their hearts were empty and they felt very uncomfortable. They left dejectedly. Even the brown official robes they wore hung weakly around their bodies. They could not be bothered with the teasing of the autumn wind. People grew up eating grains and were not invincible. How could they not be sick? But for the Fan father and son to fall sick so coincidentally, and for the illness to come so suddenly that they could not get out of bed, it was a bit too strange. Especially since Fan Xian was the direct disciple of Fei Jia of the Overwatch Council. Although he did not practice medicine, even the royal doctors in the palace knew of his methods. How could he suddenly fall sick? Not only did the officials in court not believe it, but the people of Jingdo did not believe it. In fact, even the ladies in the palace and the emperor on the dragon chair did not believe it. So after the court meeting ended, the palace guards led the royal doctors, led by eunuch Hong, who rarely left the palace, in a grandiose manner to Fan Manor. They sent an edict to express their condolences, and at the same time to see what illness the father and son had. Many of the manor's spies followed this procession. Because everyone thought the Fan father and son were pretending to be sick, They unconsciously thought that in order not to go to court and make a fool of themselves, they had offended the emperor. It was a small crime of deceiving the emperor. It was extremely stupid and extremely arrogant. The second prince also did not understand this matter. He was a prince and had grown up in the palace. Of course he knew eunuch Hong's methods. No trick of pretending to be sick could be hidden from the sickly old eunuch. Fan Xian really was sick. This news was confirmed by eunuch Hong. The emperor had no follow-up measures to prove it. It spread to every corner of the capital. No one suspected that Fan Xian was pretending to be sick. Although Minister Fan had only occasionally caught a cold, Fan Xian really was bedridden. His body was very weak. At the critical moment of the Overwatch Council and the second prince's battle, Fan Xian had unfortunately fallen ill. This reality made many people feel a very strange emotion. Would the situation in Jingdo change because of this? After all, a similar situation had occurred in history before. When the Northern Wei Kingdom's emperor was investigating the illustrious Zhan family, the reason he was able to succeed was because the famous general Zhan Qingfeng, had diarrhea for 3 days. Although history was ridiculous, it was very real. Don't worry about anything. Fan Xian frowned. He looked at Mu Tai, who was sitting in front of his bed, and said, "Just listen to Master Yan's arrangements." After returning from the capital government, he had fallen ill. Although it was not serious, after the battle with Xia Bai, he began to lose control of his jinqi. It was running around in his body, forcing him to spend more time meditating. His pale complexion and strange pulse had successfully fooled the mysterious eunuch Hong. Chapter 301. In the second half of the autumn night, the moon had gone down, and the sun had not yet risen. There was only a dark blue sky. There was a violent coughing in the back of Fan Manor. The coughing did not stop, and it did not stop for a long time. It startled the servants, and they struggled to wake up from their dreams. There was a flurry of activity in the garden. Perhaps it was a problem with the weather, but not only had Minister Fan caught a cold, but some of the servants had also caught a cold. Those with runny noses had been sent to the country estates outside the capital, but the rest of the people did not dare to be careless. They drank the medicine the young master had written every day. The medicine was very effective and the cold did not spread. The reason why the coughing made the people of Fan Manor panic was because it came from the young master's room. The young master had been suffering from a strange illness for the past 2 days. He had coughed badly, but he did not want the palace doctors to prescribe medicine. He believed in his own methods. But after a few days the coughing had not subsided. The servants of Fan Manor could not help but worry, afraid that something had happened to the young master, who had been very kind to them. The head maid, Cici, had a red ribbon tied around her forehead and combed her slightly messy hair. She stood angrily in the small kitchen. As she smelled the strong smell of medicine coming from the room, she called out to the girls who did the hard work, telling them to work faster. She was someone sent to the capital by the ancestors of Danzhou, and her future status was obvious. So in Fan Manor, her words carried some weight. The sleepy servants knew that the young master's illness was troublesome. Seeing her angry, they bit their lips and did not dare to respond. After watching for a while, Cici still could not relax. She moved a small stool and sat in front of the medicine stove. She held a fan in her hand and gently waved it. She stared unblinkingly at the mouth of the stove, where the medicinal mist was rising. Her eyes gradually turned red and she did not dare to be careless. Brewing medicine was very particular about the heat. The medicine in front of her was for the young master to take. If she did not watch, she would not feel at ease. In the bedroom, Lin Wanner was wearing a cotton robe embroidered on the outside. She rubbed Fan Xian's chest, feeling sorry for him. Carefully she asked, "How about, we really try the royal doctor's prescription?" Fan Xian coughed until his face was red. He waved his hand and forced a smile. "How could I be so precious? Besides, I know my own body. I won't die. Just prescribe some medicine for myself." Lin Wanner also knew that her husband's medical skills were exceptional, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to cure the lung disease that had haunted her for 15 years. But these past few days she had heard him coughing violently, so she couldn't help but feel worried. Biting her lip, she said, "Even eunuch Hong can't tell the cause of this illness, but you say you know you?" She rolled her eyes and said, "Should I write a letter to Mr. Fei and ask?" Fan Xian coughed again. He knew that his wife was still worried. He sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know that teacher of mine. Out of every year he spends most of the year wandering around. Even if he wanted to rush back, who knows how long it would take. He then smiled and said, maybe 3 or 4 months. By that time, I'm afraid I'll already be a dead man. You. He gently flicked the tip of Wanner's nose and jokingly said, then you'll be the prettiest widow in the capital. Lin Wanner spat on the ground a few times and angrily said, what time is it, and you still say such nonsense? Fan Xian laughed. He wasn't as nervous as the rest of the family, because he knew exactly what had happened to his body. The medicine he was brewing right now was only to help him calm his heart and clear his mind, relax his lungs, clear his meridians and stabilize his condition. As for the real cause of the illness, he would have to rely on himself to fix it. As he spoke, he comforted Wanner a bit, and then carefully placed his right hand under the blanket. His right hand would occasionally tremble. It had started outside the capital government, and it hadn't gotten any better until today. There was a knock on the door, and Cici carefully carried the medicine into the room. The servant girl, Siki, who slept with her in the front room, had long since climbed out of bed. She lit the oil lamp on the table, moved a high table, and placed it in front of the bed of the young master and mistress. She took the bowl of medicine, took out a spoon, and gently stirred the medicine in the bowl to cool it down. When the temperature was just right, she fed Fan Xian a small sip. Fan Xian drank it and it tasted a little bitter. He unconsciously licked his lips, but Cici had already stuffed a sugar pill into his mouth, and immediately diluted the bitterness in his mouth. He couldn't help but laugh. I'm a man, do you really need to serve me like this? Cici smiled and said, young master, when you were little, you were afraid of taking medicine. Fan Xian thought to himself, the medicine in this world can't be coated with sugar, so of course he would frown when he drank it. Siki took out a silk handkerchief from her sleeve and helped Fan Xian wipe the corner of his mouth. She also said very seriously, young master, you are now a patient. You can't force yourself. Seeing the two servant girls like this, even Wan couldn't stand it anymore. She laughed and scolded them, don't spoil him too much. Although she said this, her small hands kept moving down Fan Xian's back, making him feel more comfortable. Although Fan Xian enjoyed the life of a young master, and felt that it was a good thing to be so comfortable when sick, he couldn't help but shake his head. He reached for the bowl of medicine and drank it in one gulp. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and smiled. I'm a part-time doctor, not a child. The two servant girls looked at each other and smiled. They didn't say anything. Seeing that it was getting late, Fan Xian knew that his coughing had kept the servant girls busy for a while. He couldn't help but feel a little guilty. He said, after you drink the medicine you shouldn't be coughing anymore. Go to sleep. Let the servant girls who are on night watch go to sleep as well. The autumn night is cold, what if they get sick again? It's going to be dawn soon. Why are you still sleeping? It's always better to sleep a little longer, Fan Xian said seriously. They knew that this young master cared for his servants, and that under his gentle appearance was a heart that never went back on his word. Cici and Siki didn't dare to argue. They agreed in unison and went out to arrange the chores. Fan Xian got out of bed and poured a cup of tea to rinse his mouth. Wan saw this and couldn't help but say, drinking cold tea when you're sick isn't good for your body. Fan Xian smiled and sat back on the bed. I told you this illness is different from other illnesses. The couple talked for a while. Wan saw that he wasn't coughing anymore and she felt a little more at ease. She felt sleepy, but seeing that he didn't want to sleep, she didn't either. Finally, Fan Xian couldn't stand it anymore. He quietly reached out and rubbed her shoulders. His fingers brushed over a few of the calming acupuncture points on her head. Only then did she fall asleep. Looking at his sleeping wife, Fan Xian knew that she had been worried about him these past few days. She was mentally and physically exhausted. He couldn't help but shake his head. His illness wasn't something that could be cured just by taking good care of himself. It wasn't like his father's. Minister Fan's cold, under his skillful hands, was already showing signs of improvement. In about 2 more days he would be completely cured. However, his father was old and his body wasn't like a young man's. His recovery was always slower. He gently waved his hand and extinguished the oil lamp on the table 5 feet away. The entire bedroom sank into darkness, but he kept his bright eyes open. He still couldn't fall asleep because he had been sitting quietly for too long these past few days. It was not easy for him to get sleepy. The tip of his tongue gently licked the dregs of the medicine between his teeth, evaluating the herbs he had personally chosen. He seemed to be able to feel the active ingredients in the herbs enter his lungs and begin to help him soothe the discomfort. He felt a little proud of himself. He reached out and pulled the blanket over his wife's body. Then he put his hand into a secret compartment under his pillow and pulled out a small medicine pouch. Inside the pouch were several large pills that were perfectly round and rough to the touch. Although the room was dark, Fan Xian knew that these pills were red. Ever since he was young, Mr. Fei Jie had ordered him to carry these pills with him at all times, just in case something went wrong with the nameless martial secrets he was practicing. If that overbearing and ruthless Jinchi was about to break through his meridians, this pill would be his last resort. When Fan Xian was very young, when he was still living in Danzhou, Fei Jie had discovered this fatal problem. The nameless martial secrets that Wu Zhu had left for Fan Xian, or rather for Fan Xian's mother, could indeed be cultivated into an overbearing and vigorous Jinchi. The problem was that this kind of Jinchi was too overbearing and ruthless. If an ordinary person were to practice it, they would not be able to practice for long before the Jinchi in their body would burst and pierce through them. Once their meridians were broken, they would naturally become useless. But compared to the people of this world, there was something strange about Fan Xian. His meridians seemed to be much thicker than those of the people of this world. Because of this, he had been secretly practicing the nameless and tyrannical martial method since he was a baby. By the time he was 4 years old, the Jinchi in his body had already reached a shocking level, but he had not exploded and died. But Fei Jie had once said that as the Jinchi in his body grew stronger and stronger, there would come a day when the naturally formed meridian channels would no longer be able to contain it, and Fan Xian would have to suffer greatly. But after more than 10 years, Fan Xian did not feel this kind of danger. Although the Jinchi in his body was overbearing, it was still under his control. Especially after the age of 12, when he finished practicing the first volume of the Nameless Martial Secrets, the storm-like Jinchi in his body suddenly stopped. It was completely tamed and did not affect him in the slightest. So he gradually let down his guard and even almost forgot about the matter. He no longer carried the pills with him at all times but left them at home. Except when he went on a diplomatic mission to northern Qi, he had brought one with him, but he had not used it. Trouble always came when people were least prepared. After the seemingly safe but dangerous journey to northern Qi, the Jinchi in Fan Xian's body had finally merged with his skills. He had already broken through the threshold of the 9th level, and was beginning to reach the pinnacle of martial arts in the world. The overbearing Jinchi in his body had finally reached perfection, and he could even fight against Ku He's disciple, Lang Tiao. Unexpectedly, after he defeated Xie Bai and one of the 8 generals outside the capital government, the Jinchi in his body began to act up. Starting from the snow mountain at the back of his waist, along the meridians, the 2 Jinchi channels were like 2 circles, communicating with each other in his body. But now, the Jinchi seemed to have smelled some traces of the owner of his body, and it began to become restless. It was no longer willing to stay in the meridians and instead, it kept extending, probing and piercing in all directions. Fan Xian's hands were where he had perfect control of the Jinchi, but now they had become the juncture for the Jinchi in his body to overflow. Now his right hand would occasionally tremble. That was the result of the Jinchi in his muscles and meridians not listening to him. The situation was not too serious. At least it was still within his control. After these days of meditation, he had used his mind to suppress the overbearing Jinchi in his body. But the 2 opposing forces had damaged his lungs, and that was why he could not stop coughing. But if he allowed this situation to continue, there would come a day when he would not be able to control the overbearing and violent Jinchi in his body. Fan Xian had also tried to practice the second half of the Nameless Martial Secret, but so far he had not made any progress. Sometimes, when he coughed badly, he hated Wu Zhu. "You gave me the absorbing stars, so you should at least give me a way to deal with it, right?" He gently squeezed the medicine pouch in his hand and frowned. A few days ago he had analyzed the pill his teacher had left him. It was like a tiger fighting a lion. To help him deal with the overbearing Jinchi in his body, his teacher had also given him a very overbearing medicine. He had no confidence in what would happen if he took the medicine. There was a lot of mayflower mixed in it, and that was an authentic medicine for dispersing Jinchi. Was he willing to give up the Jinchi that he had painstakingly cultivated for over 10 years? Even if he did not lose his Jinchi, he feared that the Jinchi in his body would be consumed by more than half. But if he did not take it, did he have to watch the Jinchi explode into a giant ball of blood in a few months or perhaps a few years? Even if it did not have such a terrifying effect, it did not look good to have his right hand constantly trembling. He was so young and yet he had to act like someone with Parkinson's disease? To take it or not to take it, that was a big question. A rooster crowed in the distance, waking up the sun and driving away the night, but the people were still sleeping soundly. Fan Xian raised his head and realized that he had been sitting by the bed for an hour. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. He who was most afraid of death, when faced with such a difficult situation, could also be so cowardly and hesitant. Perhaps this was also an opportunity, he comforted himself. Do not destroy the shape of the Hua pool, let the heavenly spring pour into my body. He slowly recited the incantation and sat by the bed, entering a meditative state. He carefully withdrew the chaotic Jinshi in his body into his meridians, and then slowly returned it to the snow-capped mountain behind his waist, letting it shine brightly there, illuminating the snow-capped mountain. Suddenly his heart jumped and Fan Xian opened his eyes. He casually put on some clothes, pushed open the door, and walked to the most secluded corner of the garden. It was the little practice field where he had tested the poison needles. He didn't need to look around to see the strange uncle with a black cloth covering his face next to the fake mountain. He couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. He opened his mouth to complain, "So you still know to come back." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.